Hello, everyone. Welcome to the most recent Midwestern Marks stream. Glad to see you all here. Pashiko says, yay, class is starting. Yes, indeed. Class is in session. Glad you're with us today, everyone. Glad you could be with us here on this fine Wednesday. Now I'm ready to wash the dishes. Definitely. Can't wash the dishes without a podcast going in the background. So I'm glad we can have this Midwestern Marks live for you while you do those household chores. Hello, R.I.P. Sharina Buakla. Good to see you again. There was an Onion article that came out a while ago that said, like, man somehow finds the strength to do his laundry, to fold his laundry without listening to a podcast. That's a lot to ask in the modern world. So, wow, I'm super early. Cool. Glad you're all here. Hello, Comrade Eddie. Hello, Jacob. How are you? Good to see you as always. Glad we got a moderator in the chat. Hello from work. Hello. I'm glad you can listen to Midwestern Marks while you have your labor exploited at work. Trying to find that Onion article. We have a lot of cool stuff to talk about today. Not only do I have this Jordan Peterson video that we're going to react to, but I also have our chapter 2 reading guide for Lenin's Imperialism planned out, so we might do that as well. The Jordan Peterson video, I got that idea. Obviously, y'all send me a lot of stuff that you want me to react to, but I was just looking for stuff to react to, and I'm like, what happens if you search communism on YouTube? Like, what actually just comes up? What are the first things that people are seeing when they search communism? Because obviously it's worth responding to those things if they have a lot of views or they're popping up on people's page. And what I got was this. I had got this Why Communism video, but at first this was the only thing that popped up, or the top thing that popped up. We also have the Haas versus Ben Burgess debate, which I'm going to have to watch that. That's going to be interesting and probably funny. But either way, this is one of the things that came up. And it has 1.2 million views. This is an absurd video from an absurd man, Jordan Peterson, a bourgeois ideologue, one of the prized ideologues or intellectuals of the bourgeoisie. So I think it'll be worth it to respond to his arguments, as absurd as they are. And then hopefully get into Lenin's Imperialism if we have enough time today. But I'm very sore today. I wrestled with our team's national champ on Monday, and then I wrestled with my brother, who's ranked number 1 in the country, yesterday. So I'm beat up, but I'm happy to be doing a stream. Just relaxing in my gaming chair. Hello, everyone. Hello, Happy 65. Welcome back. How are you? Where Pilgrim. Hey, everybody. Hey, Where Pilgrim. Good to see you again. Cheese Guevara. boss makes $1, I make a dime. That's why I listen to Theory on Company Time. Darn right, Zach Quisenberry. And if your boss has a problem with that, he can take it up with me. I'm not sure what I'm going to be able to do for you, but I'll tell your boss to piss off. The propaganda videos that show up, 50 bajillion dead. Yeah, that's basically it. But we're going to go through some of the scholarship that Jordan Peterson uses, some of the sources that he uses to say that 50 bajillion died under communism. Well, we're just going to show how they're wrong, because it's worth it. It's worth it for the people who don't know that this guy's a fraud and a liar. And the articles he's talking about are frauds. By the way, I found that Onion article I was talking about. Man somehow musters the strength to fold laundry without listening to podcasts. This is why I'm here for you all. You can do your household chores and you don't have to listen to like podcasts from comedians just talking about random crap or whatever. You can talk about theory and develop yourself. Still got to watch the Noah and Carlos stream from yesterday. Ooh, you're getting behind. We're pumping out all these streams. It's hard to keep up with. Just kidding. We appreciate you for watching all of them. Yeah, I got home from wrestling practice yesterday and saw Carlos and Noah were doing a stream, and I put them on in my bed, and I fell asleep at like 6 o'clock. And they're like 6:30 p.m. Thankfully, I woke up within like 15 minutes and didn't end up destroying my sleep schedule. But hi, Eddie. In my opinion, Jordan Peterson might be the silliest man alive. He might be. I mean, one of the things we're going to talk about today is it's almost embarrassing that this is someone who's held up, in our culture, in our society, as like a leading public intellectual. Right, like this is, a lot of people consider him really smart. Like this is one of the smartest guys we got. And the lack of, not only just his opinions, right, his political opinions, because whatever your political opinions are, you can still do good scholarship, right? You can still stick to the scientific method, stick to the facts. And even today, you'll see I'm going to quote a lot of historians who aren't Marxists, right? Non-Marxist Soviet historians or sinologists who study China. And, you can come up with accurate results, accurate analysis, accurate statistics, even if you're an anti-communist, even if you're a liberal, right? Just by using scholarly rigor and being honest in your scholarship. And that's never, ever, ever what Jordan Peterson does. So it's not even just his political opinions that are frustrating or make him so silly. It's the lack of intellectual rigor, right? Right? The lack of scholarly rigor that he consistently shows, despite believing himself to be incredibly intelligent and despite being propped up by our culture as a leading public intellectual. But of course, in a culture, in a society dominated by the ruling capitalist class, where they can buy anything with money, this is the kind of person they're going to boost. This is the kind of person they're going to support. Somebody who pushes the narratives that they find useful, right? They're not going to boost someone like me. They're not going to boost an institute like Midwestern Marx. We've been banned from TikTok 7 times. Today, someone I know from wrestling sent me a TikTok video, and I realized I couldn't even watch it because every single social media account I own that or has been banned from TikTok on a separate occasion. So yeah, that's how we get all these silly people held up like they're the smartest people in the world. But switch to Twitch. Seems like YouTube stream is a bit delayed for me by a few seconds. Oh well, classic YouTube. Interesting. Yeah, if anybody else is having those problems, you can switch to Twitch, twitch.tv/MidwesternMarx. Or you can switch to Facebook. We're also live on facebook.com/MidwesternMarx. So obviously YouTube is the most popular way to watch, but I really like using Twitch because there are specific features that Twitch has that I like. So that's my preference, honestly. But then we have Facebook too. Howdy, comrade. First live stream. What is your opinion on video games in the industry? Love your work. I think that. Sorry, I'll just answer this question quickly before I jump into the Jordan Peterson video. But I think, well, first, I think like indie game design, independent game design is an example of unalienated labor, right? Because you have these game designers who crowdfund in order to build, program a game that they believe in, that they like, that they want to do, and that they don't want any of the big corporations infringing upon or messing with. So they have to get the funding on their own and do it fully themselves. And there are cases where you have people just putting countless hours into developing their game for almost no money. And that's because the labor is unalienated, right? You wouldn't do that for your job. You wouldn't go and work for free because you care so much about making money for your boss or doing, your everyday job, working at a gas station or whatever. But if the labor is unalienated and if it's something that you're passionate about and if it's something where your mental and physical labor are working together rather than having a divide between the mental and physical labor, because the mental aspect is being decided by your boss and the physical aspect is being done by you. Instead of that, you're involved in both the planning and the organization of the labor process and the labor process itself. That's what makes it non-alienated. So that's like indie game design. But then if you look at like the mainstream gaming industry, like I don't even really like playing video games anymore. I liked the game Elden Ring because it was like the first game I'd seen in forever that didn't have freaking microtransactions, right? It used to be a thing in gaming where if you got like a free game on your iPhone or something, you would play it, but there would be ads and then they would try and sell you stuff. It'd be like pay to win, like Clash of Clans. The more money you put into it, the faster you get stuff. But now that's like every game. Now you buy like a $60 game for a console and they're trying to, push microtransactions on you within the first 10 minutes of playing. And it's like, I paid $60 for this. Why are you trying to push more on me? And why are parts of the game still behind a paywall? So that's definitely a development of capitalism, a development in gaming where they're just trying to get every last cent out of you. And a lot of the games are super formulaic. Like every year there's a new Madden pushed out, basically the same as the last year. But yeah, gaming would be a lot better under socialism. That's how I feel. You thinking young Stalin is hot is sus. I'm sorry. It's not my fault every time I put Stalin in one of our YouTube thumbnails, it blows up. And like I was looking at that picture of young Stalin, I was like, he's a good looking guy. Like you can't deny it. And then even the older pictures of Stalin, like, for an old guy, he's definitely an attractive man. So, I make no apologies for being sus. It is what it is. Young Stalin is a babe. Yeah, I'm sorry. Young Stalin is hot. Yeah, everybody agrees. This is the consensus. Even Jordan Peterson would probably say young Stalin is hot. But anyways, speaking of Jordan Peterson thinking young Stalin is hot, let's get into Jordan Peterson's video, The Truth About Communism, this lecture that he gave. I don't know who paid him to give this lecture or what, but a lot of times these speaking engagements are funded by various NGOs, various political groups. So you have these non-governmental organizations that is what they're called, and they're heavily financed by like the Koch brothers or various banks, various large corporations, various think tanks and political institutes, which are funded by the same people. And this is one of the main ways that corporations and the ruling capitalist class push their ideas, not just marketing their ideas in general, but pushing their ideas into the academy, right? Pushing their ideas into the mainstream of academia, meaning not just blasting them over a loudspeaker to the regular populace, but getting ideologues like Jordan Peterson to push these ideas within the education system, within colleges, and things like that. And then obviously the speeches can be recorded and put on the internet and stuff too. But when I was researching Yeonmi Park, one of the North Korean defectors, who's heavily funded by right-wing libertarian NGOs and political think tanks, I was finding that there was overlap between the political think tanks who support and boost her content, and those who produce, boost, and support Jordan Peterson's content, which is probably how he got hooked up with Yeonmi Park and ended up doing an interview. But either way, now we have a bunch of speeches from people like George Bush and people like Hillary Clinton and people like Jordan Peterson, and they're paid hundreds of thousands of dollars to go up here and talk about nonsense. And you would expect, their scholarship to be super rigorous and super good and super based on facts, given that they're being paid so much money just to speak to people. But no, it's actually the opposite. You need to pay people that much money in order to get them to lie to people and push these bourgeois ideas on people and on the academy. So let's give it a listen.
Now, Nietzsche said back in the late 1800s that after he said that God was dead, and I suppose that would also be the theory of suffering that I outlined at the beginning that is at the basis of Judeo-Christian civilization, that God was dead and that people had killed him and that we'd never find enough water to wash away the blood. It's a paraphrase, but I've got the basic message right. And he also said there'll be two consequences of that: nihilism, because there's no transcendent meaning, and a move to totalitarianism because people can't tolerate nihilism. And he said the most likely pathway to totalitarianism would be communism, essentially. He didn't quite use those words, but he meant that. The words are close enough. He said socialism, but I'm going to use communism to distinguish it from democratic socialism. And he said that probably tens of millions of people would die in the 20th century as we played out that experiment. And then he said, but it might be worth it if we learn something from it. Rough, man. I mean, and unbelievable. Like, I cannot figure out how in the world he knew that was going to happen.
If you read Jordan Peterson's book, Maps of Meaning, or if you watch the breakdown of Maps of Meaning by the awesome YouTuber Hakeem, you'll realize that a lot of times Peterson just makes stuff up and he reads meaning into things, right? He just puts his own, or projects his own meaning or what he wants things to mean into them, right? So that's how you get this theory of Nietzsche predicted Stalin, I guess. He just reads Nietzsche and he's like, oh, he must be talking about the communism of the future. How did he do this? He reads into things a lot. And if you read Maps of Meaning, like, it's hard to explain, but he'll take these isolated events, historical events or things that happen, and connect them in weird ways that they don't really connect to try and draw meaning from them, which is why he calls it Maps of Meaning. But really what he's doing is just reading his own meaning into everything that he reads. That's the Jordan Peterson method of scholarship. Yeah.
Especially so far in advance. But Dostoevsky knew the same thing. He wrote this book called The Devils, or The Possessed. You could read that. That's a great book. It takes about 150 pages to get going. But once it did, like, everything snapped together after that, and then it moves. And it's basically his prophecy about, it's an examination of the kind of person who had arisen in the aftermath of the death of God in Russia, who would lead the communist revolution. That's essentially it. It's brilliant. It's terrifying. And it's a great intro to Solzhenitsyn's Gulag Archipelago, which describes what did happen when those sort of people took over the revolution. So let's look at what happened after the revolution. And we might say, well, how about we replicate the experiment a few times? Because you know how it is. If you're running a scientific experiment, you want to find out what something does if you allow it to behave. You don't want to just run it once because, well, maybe there was something specific about those conditions that led to the outcome. You want to generalize it across.
True. And socialism being an experiment, you want to learn from the mistakes of the past, which is why if you look at the inner debates within the Communist Party of China, the debates going on between Mao and others as to how to industrialize and construct socialism, move out of this impoverished feudal mode of production that they were in previously. They're very, very, very closely analyzing what the Soviet Union did, what Yugoslavia was doing, what all of these other socialist experiments were doing in their early years. So China could then, take what worked and leave behind what didn't, which, allowed them to collectivize and industrialize even faster than the USSR. China's industrialization process was the fastest in human history, and the USSR's was second. But, socialism is an experiment, and, Marxism is using the scientific method to understand society. So we should therefore learn from all the societies of the past. I don't think that's what Jordan Peterson means when he says that, though.
across multiple circumstances. So we might say, well, let's take this set of ideas and let's run it on a large scale over a very long period of time in a variety of exceptionally diverse cultures and languages. So let's do that. Okay, well, we can first start with the Soviets. People, even now, because it's like the 100th anniversary of the Russian Revolution, are celebrating Lenin. It's like, that's not good. That's like celebrating Hitler. Okay, I'm dead serious about that. It's not good.
Oh, my favorite part about that is the audience laughs at him. And he's like, I'm dead serious about that. No, I'm very serious about this, you guys. They're laughing at him when he says celebrating Lenin is like celebrating Hitler. And this is what I mean, like, but when I say it's embarrassing for our society that these are our public intellectuals, this is considered one of the smartest people in history. And then he's saying stuff like that. Like Lenin should be considered the same as Hitler. Like, which country beat Hitler, Jordan? Which country took 80% of the casualties in World War II? You know, which country was directly invaded by Hitler's forces, the Nazi forces, and beat them back when every Western analyst in existence was saying that there was no hope of the Soviet Union defeating the Nazis? It was the Soviet Union. Spoiler alert, I just said it. It was Lenin's Soviet Union, and without the Russian Revolution led by Lenin, they absolutely would not have industrialized their country at the speed they did and defeated the Germans. Absolutely not. They didn't have the military capacity. Part of the reason they were able to win when every Western analyst thought they wouldn't was because of the mass production of tanks, right? Which was only possible because of central economic planning, which was only possible because they had a socialist revolutionary government in power who said, look, the Germans are arming up and getting ready to invade. We need to build up our military forces, our military capacity, our capacity to defend ourselves. And after the Western powers tried to destroy the revolution and place sanctions on the Soviets and things like that. They also industrialized. They also ended illiteracy. They also expanded healthcare. They also did all these things, but you know, they mass-produced tanks and mass-produced things to build up their military capacity much faster than the Germans. The Germans were more focused on, they were too focused on making their tanks perfect, right? On producing the best tanks, the most specialized tanks. But the method of Soviet mass production, right? Producing these tanks, using, you know, central economic planning, using socialist planning, producing these tanks that were functional, you know, but wouldn't take that much time in production, that wouldn't take a super long labor process to make, ended up being the superior way to go. That ended up being the superior strategy. And they were able to, in a matter of like 20 years, build up their military, this incredible amount to the point where they could defend themselves from the Germans. And they did. And, you know, without them, it's likely that fascism would have taken over most of the world. But yeah, Lenin, who did that, is the same as Hitler, who invaded Lenin's country. They're both equal.
And the fact that people can dare to...
That was sarcasm, by the way. Sorry. Got to let y'all know when I'm being sarcastic.
think that that's okay means that there's something wrong with the way that we look at history. Lenin was a monster. And if you want to know about that, you can read Solzhenitsyn's writings about Lenin. Because the communist apologists say, well, it wasn't Lenin. Lenin was a good guy. He was...
And he uses Alexander Solzhenitsyn as one of the main scholars, or one of the main bases of his work. I mean, Solzhenitsyn was very biased against the revolution, was an apologist for the monarchy, who also at many times lauded Western liberal democracies, who were obviously the countries who boosted his lame-ass work with their money. But he made lots of claims, such as the claim that the gulags were worse than the Tsarist torture chambers, than the torture chambers that existed in Russia when they had a feudal monarchy dominated by these dictatorial czars. And that's just, not accurate. If it's hard to, say which one is worse, but if you're going to do that, the Tsarist torture chambers were worse, right? The gulags were labor camps where they were getting labor out of people and trying to do re-education of criminals through labor, right? It was considered a method of rehabilitation, and that's what it was considered globally at the time, not just within the Soviet Union. And then eventually, they got rid of the gulags in the 50s, I believe. After Stalin, they got rid of the gulags. But the Tsarist torture chambers were there the entire time, right? And there was no intent to rehabilitate. The intent was to threaten people. We're going to throw you in the torture chambers, these horrific prisons, if you disobey us. And it was only a method of punishment. There was no rehabilitation involved. Not to say the gulags were awesome or anything, but you can't distill the entire Soviet Union down to the gulags, because you have to look at what the Soviet Union had before the gulags. These, torture chambers that were run by the czars. Now, the thing about Solzhenitsyn's his Gulag Archipelago book, that is the basis for so many of Peterson's arguments and so much of his scholarship, is that it's considered an experimental history, right? Why is it considered an experimental history and not just a nonfiction book? Well, because it is technically a work of fiction. It's taken from the author's own personal experiences and various sources that he read, and used to create a narrative about the gulags. So what do we call this nowadays? Historical fiction, right? Where you take, you draw together historical experiences or historical sources that are real, to tell a story or to give a narrative that's not entirely non-fictional. So that's what the Gulag Archipelago is, essentially essentially a fiction book. And that's the basis for everything that Jordan Peterson believes about the USSR. And it's like, if your opinions are so correct, and if these accusations you make against the USSR are so damning, they're so terrible, and they make the whole socialist experiment worth throwing in the trash and never trying again, why can't you use regular statistics and regular data to prove that argument, right? Why can't you use regular statistics and data about the gulags? Why do you have to use a historical fiction book called Gulag Archipelago? Why do you have to use an experimental history? Why can't you just give us the history? Right? It's because if you actually went into the data and the statistics, which a lot of people have done, and compared them to this Gulag Archipelago book, you would find that, it's not accurate. A lot of the statistics are stretched because it's ultimately a work of fiction that tries to make the revolution look bad, because Solzhenitsyn hated the revolution, and was having his work boosted and funded by Western liberal Democrats or Western liberal finance capitalists. So he, stretched it to make the gulags look as horrible as he possibly could. And that's the basis for Peterson's scholarship. What a rigorous scholar he is. What a great academic who, just digs into all the sources and makes sure that everything is accurate before he speaks it in front of millions of people. Sarcasm again there.
It's all motivated by love of the working class. It's like, well, his henchman was Stalin. And if your henchman is Stalin, you're not a good guy. and Lenin was around during the early collectivization.
Stop saying Stalin like that. Stalin. It was Stalin. It was Lenin and Stalin. I don't know if Stalin was his henchman, and also Stalin was elected by the Soviet people. It's not like Lenin just said, I'm going to die soon, now you're in charge. But how can you say that post-revolutionary Russia was worse than pre-revolutionary Russia? How can you say that, Jordan Peterson? You talk about Lenin like he's just this horrible person. Lenin just thought his ideals were correct, and he didn't care how many people he killed. That's not the case. But do you want to know why Lenin was so committed to revolution? Do you want to know why Lenin had such unbreakable will and unbreakable determination when it came to having a revolution in Russia and changing the political system? Is because his brother was murdered by the Tsar. His brother was executed. He was a political execution by the monarchy, right? This is the conditions that the Russian people were living in at the time. They had like 17% literacy, which went up to 99%, a few years after the revolution and the literacy programs at launch. They had like 17% literacy. Their people were peasants. They were dominated by giant feudal landlords. They had a little bit of manufacturing and industry, but it was mostly a peasant economy and agricultural or agrarian society. And then they were dominated by this dictatorial monarchy that had torture chambers and horrific prisons like we talked about before, but they would also kill people who went against them, which is why Lenin had to go into exile multiple times. Right? But the revolutionary movement that overthrew that and then taught everybody to read and industrialize and beat the Nazis is much worse. I mean, that's just historically inaccurate. It's just not true. There were constant famines before the revolution, right? Pre-revolutionary Russia had famines all the time, anytime there were bad weather conditions. And you're going to hear Peterson talk a lot about famines in the early USSR, but for some reason, he never mentions the pre-revolutionary famines, which after the collectivization and industrialization process, which he's going to poo-poo, went away. There weren't any more famines anymore. Their resources in pre-revolutionary Russia were constantly used on senseless imperialist wars for the Tsar. That's part of the reason the revolution happened, because the military mutinied, because they were tired of just constantly being sent back and forth to fight to the death for accumulation of this dictatorial monarchy. And, you know, of course, not only were they dominated by that monarchy, but the landlord class, the feudal lords. So Russia was in a, you know, not, and this isn't, of course, to say post-revolutionary Russia was perfect or the gulags were awesome, you know, nothing like this. I'm saying, look at what they had in pre-revolutionary Russia. Look at why Lenin was so committed to revolution. It was because his brother was murdered by the monarchy and the entire country was living in poverty, while these monarchs lived in absurd, opulent, unimaginable wealth, which they were constantly sending Russian people to go fight and die in wars to expand, to accumulate more wealth. It was absolutely better after the revolution. And, you know, even an anti-communist, anti-Marxist historian should be able to acknowledge that. You know, what would you have done in those conditions, Jordan Peterson? You always talk about government authoritarianism and repression and why we need to fight against it. If your brother or one of your family members was murdered by the state for speaking out against it, and there was no industrialization and nobody knew how to read in our country, and everybody was just working all day in the countryside for these feudal lords, you wouldn't want to rise up?
And if you read what he wrote, you'll find out that he was perfectly willing to have the early collectivization. And if you read what he wrote, you'll find out that he was perfectly willing to have any number of people die as long as his ideological system could be brought into being. So there's no celebrating Lenin. There's no we're cool, young, Marxist, hip revolutionaries, and he's our idol. It's like, there's none of that. Not if you know anything. Not if you're decent.
So there it is. You got to individualize it and moralize it and be condescending towards people. You know, anybody who supports this collectivization process, which ended famines in the USSR, like we said, is just evil and stupid, unlike me. Right? When the collectivization and industrialization of agriculture is what ended famines in the country. It is what stopped famines from happening when famines had been happening very, very frequently for years and years and years and years and years and killing millions of people. Right? But when they carry out economic planning policies, which stopped that, yes, there were still famines in some of the early years of the USSR, just like there had been famines for years and years and years. You know, and yes, these happened while they were collectivizing, while they were trying to move towards this new form of agriculture, industrialized agriculture. You know, so you can associate the collectivization process with famines, but that doesn't mean that the collectivization process were the cause of the famines, you know, when you have weather conditions and various other conditions that led to the early famines in the USSR, but especially when that collectivization and industrialization process ended the famines, made it so the future people in the USSR wouldn't die because they were hungry. But that means nothing to Jordan Peterson. Famines, you know, aren't something that he actually looks at in their historical context. Right? A famine is just something that allows him to point or blame on the USSR, something he can use as a rhetorical tool to say that the USSR is bad. You know, people died in this famine, therefore this governmental system is bad, even though it ended famines. And this process of industrialization in the USSR and collectivization was the fastest process of industrialization in the history of the world at that point, and it would only be overtaken a few years later, not a few years later, but years later by China, right? Because China could learn from the mistakes of the USSR. The fastest industrialization process in the world is what Jordan Peterson thinks is evil and wrong. When the US and Europe industrialized using slavery, right? A lot of the major manufacturing capitalist entities in the US and Europe at the time were textile mills. They were making clothes, and they were incredibly dependent on the giant unlimited cotton market that was coming out of the US South, produced by slaves. But that's awesome. Jordan Peterson says Western society, European and US society are ideal, right? You can't get any better than this. This is the best society ever imaginable, right? Even though we use slavery and horrific exploitation and the genocide of indigenous people to industrialize this country. But, that's not as bad as the USSR, because some people died from famines while they were trying to industrialize agriculture and stop people from dying from famine. It's so ridiculous. It is so ridiculous when you look at the industrialization process in the USSR and, try and say it was evil and try and say Lenin did it because he hated people and just wanted to kill so many people. And then he's so condescending. And this is, the condescension that you get from a lot of bourgeois ideologues like Peterson. If you have a problem with capitalism and you want to move towards socialism, you just don't know anything, right? You don't know anything. You're just a kid. Here, let's play it again, shall we?
Not if you know anything. There's none of that. Not if you know anything. Not if you're decent.
You just don't know anything. You're just not decent. Like, dude, I promise I have spent a lot more time studying the processes of collectivization and industrialization in the USSR and China than you have. A lot more time trying to figure out what actually happened. So don't sit here and tell me and other young people that we just don't know anything or we're just not decent like you. No, we just actually look into history. We do it in a rigorous way. We accept facts when they can be proven to us, right? Whereas you will jump to any conclusion that makes socialism look bad because it's popular and it allows you to do speaking engagements funded by right-wing NGOs who, are ultimately funded by the capitalist class, the ruling class in our current society. Right, so he can just repeat that over and over again. Nobody would support socialism if they're decent, if they know as much as me. So freaking arrogant. You can repeat that over and over to young revolutionaries, but what we can't do is prove it's true, right? Because we're actually going to look into your sources. We're actually going to look into the Gulag Archipelago. We're actually going to look into the Black Book of Communism. And guess what? If they're bullshit, which they are, we're going to figure it out. Because we're not charlatans like you, Jordan. And, that lack of facts, that lack of factual evidence, material basis of which to base his arguments off of, is why he gets so emotional, right? It's why he gets emotional when he's like, Lenin is the same as Hitler. And people laugh at him. He's like, I'm serious, right? Because he can't convince everybody anymore that capitalism's the way to go. And this is the best society imaginable. And we shouldn't try and do anything better. Right? It's becoming harder and harder for him to convince everyone that we can't have anything better, especially when our generation is watching capitalism tear up the world, push us towards an environmental crisis, push us into constant wars, allow people to die of starvation every day, right? We're watching this. We know what capitalism is like, and we're becoming more and more skeptical of people like you who tell us that no better system is possible because there was a famine in 1930, right? Prove to us that socialism is worse than capitalism if you can. Prove to us. But you can't prove it to us, which is why you need to use a experimental history, right? Which is why you need to use books like the Black Book of Communism or like the Gulag Archipelago, which is essentially historical fiction. Because if you actually went into the data and the statistics and the development of the USSR over time, you would see how fast they industrialized and how fast they raised standard of living for their people despite the many mistakes that were made. And then that would debunk your argument that we can never make our current society any better, our current system any better because of the famine in 1930, like I said.
Well, there was the death of the kulaks, I told you about that. There was the Ukrainian famine, that's 6 million gone there. There was the rise of the Gulag state because it turned out that Russia, the Soviet Union, couldn't run on the principles that it had laid down as sacrosanct. They just didn't work, so you had to enslave everybody and run your economy as a slave state, essentially, and try not to kill the people in the gulags so fast that you can't suck some productive labor out of them. There's the death of tens of millions of people. We don't even know. The estimates range from 15 to 60 million. And like, we won't get too picky about the numbers because after the first 10 million, you kind of made your point. And the fact that we don't know between 15 and 60 is actually an indication of the horror of it, because our count is off by tens of millions, and that's only within the last century. And then there was the 1956 crackdown on.
Our count is off by tens of millions. That's because this isn't real scholarship. This isn't rigorous scholarship yet, and there was less ability to take like census numbers and things like that back then, just because technology wasn't as developed. But the reason there are gaps in our numbers of tens of millions of people is because this isn't actually rigorous history. A lot of these death tolls are just wildly inflated. A lot of the death tolls counted against the USSR include people who died in World War II fighting the Nazis, right? That's supposed to be considered a death of socialism or death of communism. And why do they always focus on the death tolls, right? Why is it only the death statistic, which are often inflated statistics? Why don't they give material or data-based statistical analysis of the economy, of the industrialization process at the time, of the social programs enacted? Why don't we go in detail here? Why don't we talk about a nuanced comparison of Stalin's method of economic planning enacted after Lenin's death, or compared to Lenin's new economic policy, the NEP? Why don't we talk about the differences that these affect in the economy and in people's lives? Or why don't we talk about what post-revolutionary Russia looked like compared to pre-revolutionary Russia? Or why don't we ask the question, would Russia have defeated the Nazis had they not had the revolution? Well, we can't ask that question, nor can we do actual material data-based analysis. Well, we can, Jordan Peterson can, because it would show the truth. It would show the truth that, yes, the USSR made many, many, many mistakes, but they still vastly increased standard of living for their people. And of course, they wouldn't have been able to defeat the Nazis if it wasn't for the revolution, right? They would have been walked over. They would have had this agrarian economy with no industry, with no tanks, with no weapons to defend themselves. Instead, they went through the fastest process of industrialization that had ever been seen in human history and mass-produced these tanks and other things that their military needed, to defend itself. And they lost millions of people, but they held on to their sovereignty. They beat the Nazis, and the world owes them a huge debt of gratitude for doing so. But we can't talk about historical developments. We can't talk about the material. We just have to talk about how evil Lenin and Stalin are, and how anybody who thinks that capitalism can be better or that socialism could work is also evil and dumb. Everything is brought to the individual level. It's all individualized and brought to the level of a moral judgment, either good or bad, so that Peterson can make moral judgments against individuals or against isolated events, right? There was this famine. Famines are bad, therefore socialism bad. Therefore, anybody who thinks socialism could work or criticizes capitalism is also bad and also supports famines. Right? There's no, okay, that famine happened, that was bad. Why did it happen? What were the material conditions that allowed it to happen? What were the weather factors? What was going on with the collectivization process at that time? How many tractors and actual machine industry and infrastructure did they have in agriculture working at the time? Right? There's none of that. There's no historical context or what would be actual scholarship that helps us explain the world. They just take isolated events, the famine, so that they can make a moral judgment bad against individuals, those who support socialism or Lenin or Stalin, all bad. And, it's the bourgeois method of history, the liberal method of history, the great man of history fallacy that Peterson uses to condescendingly say all young revolutionaries are just dumb and naive, when we know a hell of a lot more than him.
Hungary and the 1968 invasion of Czechoslovakia. Then there was the whole like thermonuclear Holocaust thing that was going on at the same time, and the fact that in 1962 and in 1984 we were seconds away from complete annihilation, right, during the Cuban Missile Crisis.
So I'll get into the Cuban Missile Crisis in a sec, but I forgot to say that the basis of most of his scholarship here, right? So this is the second basis for his scholarship. The first is Solzhenitsyn's, I know I'm probably pronouncing his name wrong, but his Gulag Archipelago, this experimental fiction, this historical fiction. But the second basis for his scholarship is the Black Book of Communism. And again, this is what I mean when I say it's embarrassing. It's a joke that this is considered like the greatest scholar in America. Like this is considered one of our intellectual leaders. Two of the book's own authors, two of the people who wrote the Black Book of Communism, denounced it and any association with the book because it was so historically inaccurate. And they didn't want their reputation as rigorous historians to be ruined, which, you know, anybody who cites this book as if it's true and who doesn't know this, their reputation for doing historically rigorous scholarship should be ruined. Jordan Peterson. Harvard University Press retracted the Black Book of Communism for historical inaccuracies. Freaking Harvard, which constantly pushes out State Department goons and military industrial complex goons and, you know, right-wing think tank NGO goons, denounced this book for historical inaccuracies because they knew it wasn't historically rigorous. There were tons of criticisms of this book that have been published by non-Marxist historians like Peter Kenez, who was a Soviet film historian that wrote a formal criticism of the book because he thought it was so ridiculous. Two of the book's authors said that one of the authors, Courtois, was obsessed with hitting 100 million deaths. His whole goal in writing the book was to say that communism killed 100 million people, which is hilarious and ironic that Peterson says, you know, there were a lot of deaths under communism, but after the first 100,000 or so, you've kind of made your point. Like, what do you mean? We want to know the truth. We want to know how many people actually did die, especially if it was this large number that you said. What do you mean after 100,000, you've kind of made your point? The point of scholarship isn't to make a point. The point of doing scholarship isn't to make a political point that says communism is evil. So you'll stretch and change what happened in the material reality in order to make your argument, right? Which, I mean, Peterson there kind of shows what the purpose of the Black Book of Communism was, which is what Peter Kenez in his criticism of the book says it was, just a polemic against communism, an anti-communist polemic, a way to isolate as many events as possible that make the USSR look bad, compile them and say that they killed millions and millions of people, or that communism itself did that. The book highly inflates the deaths during the famines in Ukraine, what's called the Holodomor. And obviously, we've already talked about this quite a bit, but the Black Book of Communism blames these deaths on communism, when modern analyses of the famine, even from non-Marxist historians like and agronomists, Robert Conquest is a historian and Mark Tauger is a Soviet agronomist or Soviet agricultural historian, who showed that the Black Book's deaths are highly inflated. And, you know, there's no evidence that the communists, the socialists intentionally starved people, right? You had the kulaks, the wealthy capitalist farmers who were hoarding grain and trying to hoard their wealth against the collectivization efforts of the Soviets. So yes, they had to be dealt with. But it was not Stalin taking a giant ice cream scooper and eating all the grain in Ukraine so that nobody else had any grain to eat, which is basically what the Black Book of Communism says. There's also been a really good historical analysis of the deaths in the Gulag that showed they are less than a third of what was portrayed by the Black Book of Communism, right? And then there was a historical analysis done of this book, of this scholarship, saying that the deaths were inflated by about 700,000 even in this. So they were closer to 100,000. You know, which still isn't ideal, of course, but you can't boil the entire country down to that. You can't boil the entire country down to their prison system and say this is the only thing that happened, especially when you live in the US, which has far more prisoners in jail right now doing prison labor than the Soviet Union ever had in the gulags. So the Black Book of Communism has been debunked by even non-Marxist mainstream historians. Nobody takes this scholarship seriously except for people like Jordan Peterson, which is why I keep hitting on the fact that he is not intellectually rigorous, right? His work is not up to scholarly standards, which in a world that makes sense in a socialist society within an academy and education system based on getting to the truth and understanding reality as best we can, someone like this would be debunked in seconds, right? People would be like, okay, that's not accurate. You know, you have to look at the historical context. Here's this fact, that fact, this fact. But instead, this guy's given thousands of dollars by right-wing NGOs funded by the ruling class to boost these false ideas and these false conclusions to people who might not know, to people who definitely don't know that his scholarship is non-rigorous, that his scholarship is a joke. There are also a bunch of Chinese historians. Obviously, Peterson focuses on the Soviet Union here, but sinologists and Chinese historians, non-Marxist ones, have debunked the claim that Mao killed 65 million people during the USSR. We did a video on this called "The Construction of Modern China." I actually know a lot more about China than the USSR, and the Black Book of Communism accuses Latin American countries of communism killing tons of people in Latin American countries, which is hilarious when you look at what capitalist imperialism and neoliberalism has done in Latin America with Operation Condor, and the installing of leaders like Augusto Pinochet via coup. The deaths of capitalism in Latin America would be far more than any number you could even make up to blame on communism. But there, like I said, a bunch of sinologists, Chinese historians who have debunked what the Black Book said about communism. We don't have to go into them right now, but it's a similar thing with the Great Leap Forward, where there were people who died of famine at this point, but prior to the revolution, people were dying of famine all the time. And after the industrialization and collectivization process in the Great Leap Forward, people stopped dying of famine. And today, China's abolished extreme poverty.
The keys were in the intercontinental ballistic missile release systems, and Castro, as he admitted to Jimmy Carter, in case any of you are Castro fans, which you shouldn't be, that he was perfectly willing to have Cuba annihilated if it would have meant the defeat of the United States. And then in 1984...
So that's actually not true, and I had to look that up because I had never heard of that before. So shout out to Peterson's propaganda for actually giving me the impulse to do some real research and learn what happened. But Khrushchev said that to make himself look better and make the USSR look better, probably, which screw Khrushchev, not a fan. But anyways, he said that Castro had said, to go ahead and attack the US and that Cuba was willing to be sacrificed. And Castro was so upset by that, he actually had to send Khrushchev a letter where he was like, that is not what I said. Right? I did not say to preemptively attack the U.S. and that Cuba would sacrifice itself. What he said was that the determination and the morale of the Cuban people was so high that they would be willing to fight heroically to defend their sovereignty against the U.S. and Western imperialists, even if those imperialists were prepared to use nuclear weapons, or if they were even if they would preemptively strike one of the socialist countries. And he reiterated at the end of his letter that the end of his original letter, which Khrushchev claimed he was calling for a preemptive attack, he reiterated at the end that the Cuban people would observe the events calmly, and they did not want to attack, but that everyone should be aware that the U.S. might do a preemptive attack the way that they did in Japan, right? And he said that the Cuban people were prepared for that. Right. And the U.S. couldn't just get Cuba to submit, get Cuba to bend the knee by threatening to use nukes. He said that our people's determination and their will to be sovereign is so strong that, we won't back down from the U.S.'s threats, even though they have nuclear weapons. And obviously, Castro wouldn't be calling for a preemptive strike. He knew that would get him killed. That would lead to nuclear warfare in which Cuba would be one of the first targets and which they would have no chance against the United States. And what's so hilarious about this too, this claim that Castro was willing to sacrifice Cuba to the U.S. and wanted to just attack them with nukes, is if you look at the leaked transcripts from within the State Department, from within the meetings that JFK was having with the CIA and other State Department officials, there were constantly State Department higher-ups and CIA officials trying to get JFK to use nukes, telling him that Cuba wanted to preemptively strike the U.S. and the USSR wanted to do a preemptive strike, so we should attack them first. There were literal people in JFK's ear telling him to do this, telling him to launch the nukes. And he didn't, and then he came for the CIA, and then he ended up getting assassinated, which is a video for a different day. But we're supposed to believe communism could never work because of a sketchy, probably not true story or letter that Castro said he wanted to preemptively attack the U.S. when Castro said absolutely not. That's not what we want to do. We want to act in self-defense and not give up our political and economic sovereignty. That proves communism doesn't work. But in the capitalist countries, where CIA and State Department higher-ups are begging the president to launch nukes in another country, that doesn't prove capitalism doesn't work. By your own logic, JP, these transcripts prove that capitalism could never work, and anybody who supports it is actually a bad person who doesn't understand history. Which, that's actually kind of true.
Approximately, I may have the date exactly wrong, the Russians received an indication from their early warning systems that the Americans had launched 5 thermonuclear missiles, and one Russian decided that it was a mistake and refused to launch the retaliation. And he just died about 2 weeks ago. So, that was pretty close. And so that was experiment number 1, let's say. That wasn't good, that experiment. Let's put it that way. It wasn't good. It was exactly the antithesis of good. It was precisely the antithesis of good. But that wasn't all. I mean, there's the People's Republic of China. That's a different country, like seriously a different country.
So he says it was the antithesis of good, which is almost a Marxist word or a dialectical word. Everything has its antithesis. Everything has its opposite. But why didn't you mention any of the good things that happened in the USSR then, Jordan? If we're going to make an honest experiment, if we're going to make an honest analysis of this experiment and look at it as an experiment, sure, you can mention the gulags. You can say that was bad. You can look at the Cuban Missile Crisis. You can say that was bad. You can isolate a lot of things and say they were bad. You can say that the collectivization process in Ukraine should have gone different and, should have understood that the kulaks were going to try and hoard grain and resist the economic planning and, do things differently. Hindsight's 2020. But, like I said, that's what China did when they were trying to go through a similar process of industrialization and constructing socialism. They looked at what the Soviet Union had done, said, I think the actual phrase they use is like 70% of what Stalin did was good, 30% bad. And we throw out what was bad and we take what was good. But you can't do that if you only look at the bad, right? All you did, Jordan, was isolate a bunch of historical events, talk about them not within their historical context to say that they were bad, and therefore the whole experiment is bad. It's the antithesis of good. Well, okay, if you're going to make that judgment, then you have to talk about the good stuff. You have to talk about the fact that it was the fastest increase in life expectancy ever seen in human history at the time, and the fastest industrialization, and that the USSR blew Japan out of the water and blew other capitalist countries out of the water when it came to industrialization and doing this. You have to mention that literacy was 17% before the revolution, 100% after the revolution. You have to mention that they, created more tractors and created more agricultural infrastructure than any other country at the time, faster, which ended famines. There had been famines going on for years and years and years and years prior. There were some famines in the early years of the USSR, and then they went away because they industrialized agriculture and they could produce enough for all their people. Right? So if you're going to say this was the antithesis of good, you also have to discuss the things that are good so people can make an honest judgment. But you're not doing that because you're not an honest person. You're not an honest historian. You're not an honest scholar. You're somebody who's trying to make a political point. You're somebody who's trying to portray an ideology you don't like as being wrong and evil. So we don't get a dialectical analysis of the good and the bad, which if you want, an actual dialectical analysis, like I said, read the debate within the Communist Party of China at the time and what they were saying about the USSR and the criticisms they were making of it. But yeah, Peterson just isolates the bad because this is a work of propaganda, not a work of scholarship.
Right? Different tradition, different language. How many people died in China under Mao? No one knows. Same issue with the Soviet Union, although Mao was a bigger monster than Stalin, and that's impressive, because there's Hitler, there's Stalin, and there's Mao. And of the three, Mao was probably the worst. He's still revered in China. Maybe that accounts for their affinity for North Korea, which could still destroy us all, the remnant.
Welcome to Watch Mojo Jordan Peterson's top 10 most evil communist leaders. At this point, he's just listing them off. There was Stalin and Mao, and this one was worse than that one. Okay, how, Jordan? How, Jordan? I keep hearing this guy was bad, that guy was bad. They're so evil, you can't even laugh at it. It's not funny. How do you make the moral judgment that Mao was more evil than Stalin? And how do you measure evilness on a scale? Oh, wait, you can't. It's an arbitrary moral judgment that you can place on anyone that allows you to make whatever argument you want, including these absurd, baseless, ahistorical arguments you're making here. And, oh, shoot. Did he mention the Great Leap Forward yet? Here, we'll play till he mentions the Great Leap Forward, then I'll continue.
Of that horrible state. Maybe 100 million people died in China during the Great Leap Forward. That's a hell of a leap forward. Well, maybe it wasn't 100 million, maybe it was only 40 million. But
it was quite literally a very great leap forward. It was quite literally the fastest increase in human life expectancy ever seen in human history. Right? Previously, it was the USSR, which you said was all evil and never did anything good. And then they were overtaken by China. Right? The first 10 years of the revolution, fastest increase in life expectancy ever. Watch our video on the construction of modern China if you want a more detailed analysis of this. But that wasn't that didn't do anything good, right? There was a famine at the time, right? So if there's a famine at the time, that means all of it was bad and everything China ever did was bad, even though, same with the USSR, there were constant famines in pre-revolutionary China. And then after the Great Leap Forward, after the industrialization and collectivization of agriculture, no more famines, and eventually they abolished poverty. But it's so easy always for people who live in industrialized nations, like Jordan Peterson, somebody who's never lived without the comforts of the Western world, who's never lived in a society without industrialized agriculture, where most of the people are peasants working under feudal landlords like pre-revolutionary China was. It's so easy for him to dismiss the gains of the revolution in China and the construction of socialism in China. Oh, yeah, so what? They industrialized and taught everyone to read. And, now within 10 years, they were able to feed everyone and bring everyone healthcare. Who cares? We have those things in the U.S. That's why the U.S. is better. The U.S. industrialized using imperialism and slavery and terrible exploitation. They still did it much slower than China. And yeah, the early years of the revolution were hard, right? China needed to figure out how to meet millions and millions and millions of people's needs, and they didn't have anything. Not only did they not have infrastructure and steel and industry, but their people didn't even know how to make steel. Their people didn't even know how to work with industry because they had been peasants doing farming for the feudal landlords for years. So that's why they needed these backyard furnaces, which have become, a famous thing in Western propaganda. They claim that Mao had these backyard furnaces because he was so inept. He didn't know how to run an economy, and he had people making steel in their backyard. This generation, who they learned from, always. But that was because China didn't have any industry, so their people didn't know how to do anything except run a peasant economy. So they had to use backyard furnaces to teach their people steel working, so the farmers could learn how to use steel, learn how to make tractors, so they could industrialize agriculture and produce enough to feed everybody, which they did, despite the fact that people did die of famines in the beginning. But like I said, those famines were caused by weather conditions, and they were happening for years prior. Famines were rampant in China before the revolution. But of course, the historical context is never given. We have to isolate historical events. We have to isolate them from their context. Otherwise, they might make sense to people, and people might actually have a realistic understanding of history and how the world works. Right? The famine during the Great Leap Forward in China was the last one. It was the last one before agriculture was industrialized and they could produce enough food for everybody. Right? And like I said, the collectivization process was hard. It was, but it freed their people from starvation and freed their people from imperial domination. The sacrifice of those people in early China to industrialize and collectivize saved the future of their country, which is why the U.S. hates it so much, which is why the U.S. actually looks at the Great Leap Forward as if it was the worst thing that's ever happened in human history. And here's the video on the construction of modern China if you want to watch it.
As I said before, when you're counting in the tens of millions, your point's already made. And then there was Cambodia and the killing fields, and Bulgaria and East Germany and Romania and the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, that's North Korea, and Vietnam and Ethiopia, Hungary, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. It was never a successful communist state. Cuba, I suppose, came closest, but it was radically, the Soviets poured money into Cuba, so that doesn't really count. Hungary, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. It was never a successful communist state. Cuba, I suppose, came close. People's Republic of Korea, that's North Korea, and the killing fields, and Bulgaria and East Germany. It's a hell of a leap forward.
Sorry, I want to replay this point, or replay this part.
Well, maybe it wasn't 100 million, maybe it was only 40 million. But as I said before, when you're counting in the tens of millions, your point's already made. And then there was Cambodia and the killing fields, and Bulgaria and East Germany and Romania and the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, that's North Korea, and Vietnam and Ethiopia, Hungary, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
So you almost got to wonder if that part's like a joke. I know it's not a joke. I know he's serious because he takes himself so seriously despite his scholarship being so unserious. But he mentions the DPRK, Cambodia, and Vietnam. Okay, after becoming communist, the U.S. killed 20% of the DPRK's population and leveled every building over 2 stories tall. There were members of the U.S. military who were switching sides and going to fight for Korea because they recognized that they were the bad guys. And that 20% of Korea's population statistic comes from a U.S. Air Force General, Curtis LeMay. And a lot of what we know about Korea comes from former U.S. military. One of them said that the pilots, the U.S. pilots, were complaining that they didn't have any targets left to bomb, because they had carpet bombed the country so thoroughly, destroyed all of their infrastructure, and leveled every building over 2 stories tall while killing 20% of the people, 1 person in every family of 5, that they didn't have any targets left to hit. So that's Korea, the DPRK. Is that a failure of communism? Is that how communism fails? It attracts the U.S. and gets the U.S. to murder 20% of your population, 1/5 of your population. That sounds like an issue with capitalism. That sounds like an evil of capitalism. That sounds like more of a reason to get rid of capitalism. Or what about the killing fields in Cambodia? You mean Pol Pot, who was backed by the CIA? Pol Pot, who said that he didn't understand Marxism? Pol Pot, who was eventually taken out by the Vietnamese communists, despite, unfortunately being backed by China, or being supported by China, which is one of the foreign policy mistakes of China. But then Henry Kissinger, not only did the U.S. back Pol Pot, but Henry Kissinger committed genocide in Cambodia. He told the military, anything that moves or flies, hit, kill it. And millions were killed, which is why Anthony Bourdain, the late Anthony Bourdain, said before he died, after you've been Kissinger to death with your bare hands, because of the amount of pain and suffering that Henry Kissinger, who supported capitalism, was a puppet of the Western finance capitalists, not communists, because of the devastation that he enacted on their country and the millions he killed, the millions of people who were left without family members, or who starved in the aftermath because their infrastructure was destroyed by U.S. bombs. But yes, this proves that communism could never work, because Pol Pot called himself a communist while getting CIA money. And then he says Vietnam too. Peterson mentions Vietnam, the DPRK, Cambodia, and Vietnam. That's proof that communism doesn't work. Like, do I even have to say anything about Vietnam? Do I really? Can everyone just watch the movie Platoon? Right, and see how Oliver Stone's movie Platoon about Vietnam, where the soldiers realize that they're the bad guys and how senseless this war is, and how, millions of people are being left with trauma, PTSD, because they're watching the most horrific things happen. A movie that portrays the U.S. massacres, where they went into civilian areas and just murdered people. A war where the U.S. dropped thousands and thousands of tons of Agent Orange and napalm on this country who never attacked us. Yeah, that shows the failure of communism. And he said there's never been a successful communist state. Like, JP, Vietnam won that war, right? Even with all of the stuff that I mentioned earlier, the DPRK and Vietnam still beat back the U.S. Another dub for communism.
It was never a successful communist state. Cuba, I suppose, came closest, but it was radically, the Soviets poured money into Cuba, so that doesn't really count. So then the first question was, well, are these Marxists motivated by love or hatred? Well,
I think the Marxists in Vietnam and Korea were motivated by sovereignty, by having political and economic control and independence of their own country. So they had both been colonized for years by the Japanese and the French, and they overthrew those colonizers and were quickly invaded by the U.S., who tried to seize those colonies. So at first they were motivated by independence, sovereignty, which is something that the U.S. claims to believe in, which is why Vietnamese communist leader Ho Chi Minh, when they were waging their independence struggle against the French, read the U.S. Constitution and asked the U.S. for help, said the U.S. supports freedom and democracy, you should support our struggle, which is when the U.S. invaded and killed millions of people with bombs. But I imagine these Marxists in Korea and Vietnam were motivated by hatred after the U.S. bombing campaigns and civilian massacres against their people and the destruction of their infrastructure and the lies that the U.S. told to justify all this horrendous, just absurd murder and destruction that they enforced their own system without having millions of their people killed with bombs. So yeah, I'm sure a lot of them were motivated by hatred, and that's probably why they were able to hold on to their sovereignty, even though, in Korea, 20% of their population was killed. Or in Vietnam, the soil today is still messed up from the tons of Agent Orange and napalm and deadly chemicals launched on their people. Yeah, I'm sure they started hating the U.S. after that, and they said, we're going to dig our heels in and not give up our homeland to these imperialist invading colonizers. I'm sure they were motivated by love in some ways too, but...
Is it love or hatred that produces 100 million dead people? And is that enough evidence or not? And if it's not enough evidence, if you think to yourself, well, that's not enough evidence, it was never really given a proper try. It's like, well, what would have been a proper try? See, I always think when I hear someone say that, I know what you think. You think in your delusional arrogance that you understand the Marxist doctrines better than anyone else ever has, and that if you were the one implementing those doctrines, you would have ushered in the utopia. That's what you mean when you say that. And
no, Jordan, it's the exact opposite. You are projecting the character trait of delusional arrogance. You are so delusional and so arrogant, or so paid off by libertarian right-wing NGOs to give these shitty speeches, to listen to anyone else, to listen to any actual historians, to engage with any actual historical analyses. So you just give these death counts, these death numbers in countries like Vietnam, Korea, and Cambodia, where the U.S. has killed far more people than any communist. You give these death counts and say, is that not enough evidence? No, because you're not actually giving any evidence. You're just listing the amount of people who died, right? Which everyone dies. And if you tallied up the amount of death inflicted by capitalism through various means, it would be way, 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 way higher, especially in these specific countries that you mentioned. So then you talk so condescendingly towards you're all just delusional and arrogant because you criticize the current system. You're delusional and arrogant. You think you know everything about every field of academia and you can speak confidently on it, but despite being a behavioral psychologist, when you have a childish grasp on history in other fields related to history and social sciences. So all you can do is just cherry pick unscholarly work, which you're too lazy to figure out is actually unscholarly work. You're too lazy to look into the criticisms of the Black Book of Communism and these books that you love. So in your delusional arrogance, you talk down on anybody who criticizes capitalism like they're morons and you've got it all figured out. I've never seen such a better example of projection. It's crazy. I mean, I've spent countless hours researching this stuff. I've spent countless hours researching socialism and existing socialism and trying to figure out exactly what was going on and whether or not people like you were lying to me. Right? But you just skim the numbers, just Google the numbers in the Black Book of Communism and think you got it all figured out. How arrogant are you? How is there any scholarly or intellectual rigor in your brain at all? Right? Is there any self-questioning or self-criticism at all? Or do you just Google stats that meet your narrative and then, profess them as if they're truth and say anybody who disagrees with the conclusions that you drew from those stats is just delusional and arrogant? Like, fuck you. You are the most delusional and arrogant scholar I've ever seen in my life. It's all projection. It's all projection. Like, him talking about all the people killed in Vietnam, Cambodia, and the DPRK, it's all projection of what capitalism's done, right? And when he calls Marxists delusional and arrogant for wanting to look at things in their historical context, it's all projection. He knows he's delusional and arrogant, and he's got to put it on other people. And as a psychologist, you'd think he'd know that. You think he'd know about the psychological phenomena that is projection.
They say, and there's an idea in the New Testament that there's a sin, it's the sin against the Holy Ghost. If you commit that sin, no one really knows what it is, that you can't be forgiven. And I would say, well, if you want a candidate for the sin against the Holy Ghost in the 21st century, the statement, real communism was never tried, with the underlying idea that if you had been the person implementing it, it would have worked, I think that's a pretty good contender for something for which you should never be forgiven.
God, could he be any more dramatic? Could he be any more dramatic? You've sinned against the Holy Ghost for supporting socialism, and you can never be forgiven. And then they laugh at him, and he walks back behind the podium like dead ass serious. Like, calm down, dude. You just said a bunch of nonsense. You didn't say anything that deep, right? This isn't a mic drop moment. Everything you just said was stupid. But I'm sorry, guys. I can't support communism anymore. I can't do it. Marx failed to consider that communism is a sin against the Holy Ghost. I didn't realize that. I hadn't realized I sinned against the ghosts. My bad. I don't like communism anymore. Capitalism's the way to go. We all failed to consider the Holy Ghost. I thank you for giving us an example, another example of why Marx was right, Jordan. Religion is not just an opium of the masses, but a tool for reinforcing the existing relations of production. Right? If you go against the existing relations of production between capitalist and wage labor, if you go against capitalism, you're sinning against the Holy Ghost, which is unforgivable. You're being irreligious. You're doing the worst thing you could possibly do. Which, sounds a lot like the divine right of kings during the era of feudalism when they had monarchs, like in pre-revolutionary Russia. Right? We can't change anything. We can't do anything different. We can't move towards capitalism. Don't you know about the divine right of kings? The kings have been appointed by God as our authority. We can't question it. And if we do, it's unforgivable. You've sinned against the Holy Ghost. Yeah, okay. I'm good. I'm good on that. I'm tired of seeing millions of people die in wars and die of starvation and die because they don't have health care and die because there's an opioid crisis created by for-profit pharmaceutical companies. I don't think it's a sin against the Holy Ghost to be against that stuff. And also, a lot of the Marxists nowadays don't say, you know, Marxism's failed every time it's been tried, but let me try it. You know, a lot of us Marxists today think that's pretty dumb, and the people who say that are being silly, right? But what we actually do is stop just taking historians like you in the Black Book of Communism at their word, historians like Jordan Peterson, who's not even a historian, he's a psychologist, and we've started actually looking into the historical evidence of what happened in these areas, right? What happened in these countries where apparently Mao and Stalin were just massacring people for no reason. And we found that, you know, the reason that you, Peterson, and the Black Book of Communism try and isolate historical events where people died is so that they can find a way to blame any death they can on socialism without ever discussing any of the gains of socialism, right? One of the funniest things Peterson says in that lecture, that nonsensical lecture, is, you know, millions of people died, 100 million people or whatever. 100 million is the number that the one Black Book of Communism author was obsessed with reaching. So Peterson says, is that not enough evidence for you? Like, of course that's not enough evidence. That's one data point. You've given me one statistic, number of deaths, right? Which there's going to be a lot of deaths in every country because humans are mortal and we all die, right? So I'm going to need a little bit more than the number of deaths, right? Especially when you're talking about the collectivization process in the USSR and China, right? Compare the Peterson's analysis where he lists one statistic to a dialectical materialist analysis that looks at production and the development of production over time and how that affects the superstructure, how that affects the politics. All right, you'll see that the education system was expanded greatly. The healthcare system was expanded greatly because the productive base was industrialized. They moved towards machine production and they moved out of these feudal relations of production where people were dominated by monarchs and landlords. They taught their entire country to read. They were able to defeat the Nazis. Like we said, there were all these gains that were made because of the productive advancements that are just completely ignored, never even discussed, never even brought into the conversation by Peterson, right? He just isolates the number of deaths as the only statistic and then says, is that not enough evidence for you? Like, no, dumbass. And that shouldn't be enough evidence for you if you were actually a real scholar and not a goon paid off by libertarian think tanks to spit nonsense. Is that not enough evidence for you? This one statistic? No, you dipshit. Why would that be enough evidence? Why would one statistic isolating deaths be enough evidence for any historian worth their salt? Especially if, you know, you consider the deaths created by capitalism, even from things that Americans consider to be good, right? Like I said, a lot of the times they'll count the deaths of revolution in China and Russia as deaths that happened during the Civil War that followed the revolution, or deaths that happened during the revolution, or deaths that happened when the USSR was defending themselves from the Nazis. Those are blamed on communism. Okay, well, let's use those same metrics then for the US. Are all the deaths caused by the US during the World War II, both of our own citizens and others in the countries we're fighting, are those victims of capitalism? I mean, they actually are, because World War II was a capitalist imperialist war ultimately. But were the people killed in defeating the Nazis deaths of capitalism that prove our economic system could never work? Right? Or what about the Revolutionary War in the United States? What about the people killed by General George Washington? Is he a general or what? I don't know. What about the people killed by the revolutionary forces in the U.S.? Right? Are all those people victims of capitalism, Jordan Peterson? Or how about the Civil War? Right? How about the Civil War when the northern industrial capitalists were drawn into a class conflict with the Southern slave owners, right? The Civil War is considered by Americans to be a liberating thing. It ended slavery, right? We had to fight a war for it, but we ended the slave mode of production and moved towards a capitalist mode of production, freed the slaves, right? Are all of those deaths of capitalism? Could I just tally up the amount of people who died in the Civil War, call it deaths of capitalism, and say, isn't that enough evidence for you? Isn't this enough evidence that capitalism could never work? Kermit the Frog. You see how stupid the method of analysis that he uses and that the Black Book of Communism uses is if you put the shoe on the other foot, right? If you try and look at the US and these events that are considered progressive in our country's history, but were violent, were events where different economic classes were drawn into conflict, and just say this is proof that a certain economic system doesn't work. It's insane. It's literally insane. And of course, he doesn't ever talk about the deaths of starvation, the deaths due to lack of infrastructure, malnutrition, the various deaths that happen every day under capitalism because of how capitalist production is managed. He doesn't mention the 40,000 people who die every year in the US, the wealthiest country on earth, because they don't have health care, right? Or all the people who died like that in Cuba before the revolution brought health care to everyone in all the rural areas. 100 rural hospitals have shut down in the US, well over 100 rural hospitals in the past 10 years alone, right? So we can't even bring health care to people here. 40,000 people are dying because they don't have health care every year, while 100,000 are dying because they're victims of the opioid crisis created by for-profit pharmaceutical companies, right? But that's not evidence that capitalism doesn't work. Only people who died in 1930s Russia due to a famine caused by weather conditions. And that proves socialism doesn't work. Can't apply the same logic to capitalism, though. Otherwise, it might go against our narrative. Friggin', what a video. What a video. I'm going to have to cut that into parts like I do with most of Peterson's work. Because there's usually too much nonsense to debunk in a short period of time. But yeah. What makes me so mad about it is what I've said repeatedly during that segment. The fact that he's considered like one of the great academics in America. He's considered one of our society's like smartest public intellectuals. And as someone involved in academia who actually does try and have, intellectual or scholarly rigor, who does actually try and get to the bottom of things and not talk out my ass about things, it's insane and frustrating to watch someone who's making millions of dollars with, not even a fraction of the scholarly rigor, with no scholarly rigor to speak of, just pulling things out of his ass and throwing them to the libertarian NGOs who he knows will give him $1 million to say those things. So base and superstructure is a good way to explain a lot of things about society. But Peterson is a perfect example of what I'm trying to get a picture of the base and superstructure here. A perfect example of what the capitalist education system is like and how it reinforces and conditions the capitalist relations of production. So here, hopefully you can see it in a sec. I got to get my Stream Deck going. Where are we? So here we see in the superstructure, which is anything not connected to production, you have art, family, culture, religion, philosophy, law, media, politics, science, and education. So these help shape and maintain the base, which is things related to production, things related to economics, tools, machines, factories, land, raw materials, but most importantly, the relations of production, the economic classes. So you have the dominant, exploiting, non-working class, the capitalist, the bourgeoisie. And then you have the working class, the proletarians, who are exploited by them. Those are the relations of production at the core of our system. That's how things are produced. The capitalists organize and administrate production and appropriate, take home the surplus created by production, and the workers go in and work. The only commodity they have to sell is their labor power. And under capitalism, you have to sell a commodity to survive. And these relations of production, because they allow, the Koch brothers and all their buddies in the ruling capitalist class to accumulate tons of wealth and spend that money on NGOs and influencing various academics and, influencing the media and pushing their ideas, the education system is shaped by the relations of production. And then, because you have bourgeois ideologues pushing capitalist ideology, pushing an ideology and pushing education that reinforces these relations of production, they help maintain and shape the base, the economic base. So because our economic base is based on relations of production where the capitalist class is dominant, when you search communism on YouTube, the first thing that comes up is Jordan Peterson talking about how communism's evil and how it could never work, with a bunch of nonsense ahistorical evidence to back up his theory. But yeah, that's just part of the capitalist superstructure. It's the capitalist superstructure revealing itself. Yeah, shout out to Jordan Peterson for being terrible. That might have been worse than his video with Yeonmi Park, y'all. That might have seriously been worse than his video about the DPRK. Also, he said communism's a utopia again. I can't... Where? I'm looking for a book. I'll be right back. I can't fucking do it with these people anymore. I can't do it. Stop saying communism's a utopia. This book is not long. This book is, I don't even know if it has page numbers. I counted them once. They're like 80 pages. Okay, I know this is more scholarly work. This is more research than you've ever done in your academic career, Jordan Peterson. Right? So this is going to be pretty hard. But read this. Set down Gulag Archipelago or set down the Black Book of Communism statistics that you Googled before your speech and read this. Right? Set down the Communist Manifesto, which is the only Marxist work that you've ever read. And then you think you understand it all because, like I said, you're arrogant and delusional, like you accuse other people of being. But just read this. Open your mind. Do some actual scholarly work for once and research what's in this book. It is Engels criticizing the utopian socialists, people who thought we could enact a utopia. He's directly criticizing them and saying, no, we need class struggle, which will lead to the construction of a new system out of the wreckage of the old system. So we need to take capitalism as it exists, look at the classes within capitalism, have the exploited classes rise up. But once they do rise up, we can't just go to a utopia. That's impossible. It doesn't make any sense. We need to construct socialism slowly over time using what we already have, using the conditions that capitalism has created. And capitalism increases humans' productive capacity a great deal, creating the possibility, creating the conditions which make socialism realizable, which makes socialism possible. This is the idea of scientific socialism. And that never, ever, 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 ever in Marx or Engels' work at any point will you see them saying that we can create a utopia, right? Not only can we not create a utopia overnight, not only do we need to construct socialism out of our current system, but we'll never reach a utopia. It doesn't make sense. You could always stub your toe under communism and be like, ow, I guess this world isn't perfect. I guess it's not a utopia. Like, of course, there's no utopia. I think Marx and Engels were so stupid that they believed that. The only reason you think that is because you've never actually read them, because you're a fraud, Jordan Peterson. You are an academic fraud. You're like the guy in wrestling who gets pinned every time he goes out there to wrestle and who leaves practice every day because he has a boo-boo and he's crying or because he's tired. And then talk shit about how you're the man. Talks about how, I totally would have beat that guy if, I didn't stub my toe. You just make excuses for yourself. Peterson thinks he's got it all figured out. He thinks he has this great grasp on history, and anybody who disagrees with him is simply delusional and arrogant, when he's the delusional and arrogant one. Which is kind of how psychological projection works. Or use the audiobook. They're everywhere these days, LOL. Yeah, seriously. On the way to your next speaking engagement, Jordan Peterson, listen to Socialism, Utopian, and Scientific on audiobook. I know that it's going to ruin your whole presentation. You're going to be like, oh, I can't give this speech because I just figured out I'm wrong about everything after reading this short pamphlet, but it'll be worth it. You don't want to keep running around sounding like an idiot. That's the legacy you're going to leave on this earth. You don't want it to be like that. Long live Stalin. If you want to see the future of society, go to China. Facts. Facts. Yeah, I recommend people watch that video I made on the construction of modern China. I had just a little bit more written down to talk about with the Great Leap Forward and to go in depth on, but I figured I had done enough going in depth with Soviet historians and stuff. And I have this other video on the construction of modern China that you can check out. So I didn't want to get too in depth about Chinese agricultural policy and stuff like that, but this video is freaking fantastic. Sorry, I just tooted my own horn. That video will explain it to you. That video is not fantastic. It was made by me, so I can't call my own video fantastic. But I'll tell you that I put a lot of work into it and a lot of effort. So almost missed the stream. I'm glad you didn't, Patrick. Glad to have you with us. Porden Jeterson makes me lose brain cells. Same. Every time. Every time. I once wrote a college paper for U.S. history after the Civil War class that talked about the Soviet POV on the Cuban Missile Crisis. And my professor said that it really made him consider the U.S. narrative about the event, and he gave me a 95%. Oh, that's cool, Jacob. Maybe we should publish that. I mean, maybe it'll probably require some edits if you wrote it in high school, but like we have a Midwestern Marks Youth League, right? We have articles that are published by younger folks. Trying to open your article because I'm pretty interested in reading that. Yeah, and not a lot of people. I think I had to read about you were a freshman in college. Yeah, let's publish it. Let's do it. I read. Can you email it to me at Midwestern Marks, Jacob? Because it'll be hard for me to get in the chat here. It's not showing up on Twitch for me. So if you email it to me, I'll remember to look at that. But not everyone has read those leaked transcripts from JFK and from within the missile crisis. I had to read them for a U.S. history class, and my mind was blown. My mind was blown. I was like, what is this? There are people who were in JFK's ear in these meetings of U.S. officials when this was happening, telling him to nuke the USSR, telling him to nuke Cuba. And then we look back on this historically, and we're like, oh, the USSR and Cuba are so evil. They almost ended the world with missiles because they were going to retaliate to the U.S. Like, no, they didn't. We almost ended the world with missiles. We were the aggressors. And there were people telling JFK to launch them, which is why he came for the CIA, who were telling him to launch missiles based on false information, telling him that Cuba and the USSR were going to preemptively strike us when they weren't. And JFK came after the CIA and ended up getting murked. It's truly amazing with some of these things that that bourgeois historians can even find a way to make the U.S. look good. They can find a way to make the Western society look like the greatest society ever, and all socialist countries is literally evil, literally run by dictatorial madmen who just want to kill people for fun. And he's like, was China and Vietnam run by hate or love? Who knows? Like, maybe hate and love aren't what run a country, right? Maybe the U.S. is run by capital. Maybe these countries are trying to construct societies that aren't run by capital, right? Why does it all have to come down to hate and love, these individualistic, moralistic judgments? It's because the bourgeois historians, the bourgeois ideologues individualize and moralize everything rather than give materialist analysis. They only look good through omission. The U.S. had nukes in Turkey before the Cuban Missile Crisis. Also true, also never talked about. Missiles which were pointed at the USSR. And there's some statistic about those missiles, like they were more threatening to the USSR than the missiles in Cuba would have been to the US. But yeah, it's just the Soviet Union. It's funny too, because the crisis was created by the US by the Soviets trying to do exactly what the US had done. The US put missiles in Turkey, pointed them at the Soviets. The Soviets said, okay, if you're going to point nukes at us, we want to be able to defend ourselves. So we've got an allied country near your country. We'll put missiles there. Exactly like you did to us. And then the US freaks out and says the Soviets almost ended the world. Well, that's interesting, isn't it? That they almost ended the world by doing exactly what you've been doing. But when you pointed nukes at them, that didn't almost end the world. It's only when they pointed them at us. I see. I see how this works. Yeah, the Dulles brothers wanted war with Cuba while JFK was trying to step away from military solutions to the Cuban problem. Absolutely. Shout out to the Dulles brothers, by the way, two of the earliest architects of U.S. imperialism. Two of the people who manufactured the Guatemalan overthrow of Jacobo Arbenz. One of them was a lawyer for the United Fruit Company, which was exploiting Latin and Central America at the time, large swaths of it. And his brother was the CIA director. I can't remember. It was Alan Dulles and John Foster Dulles. I can't remember which was which. And I think maybe they both served as CIA director at one point. But either way, the one who was the lawyer for United Fruit went to his brother as the director of the CIA, and they plotted one of the very first U.S. CIA coups, one of the very first U.S. overthrows of a foreign country. It was just after his 1954 Arbenz was overthrown. In 1953, Mohammad Mossadegh in Iran was overthrown. So this was the second successful U.S. coup that I know of. And Jacobo Arbenz was later found boiled to death in a bathtub. But it does not surprise me that the Dulles brothers, even after they did that to Guatemala, were coming for Cuba. One of the most heinous things about the coup in Guatemala of Arbenz was that the areas of the United Fruit Company, the areas of their land that he wanted to give to the people and nationalize and use productively, use to help the people, were not even being used by United Fruit. Right? Arbenz wasn't a communist. He wasn't a socialist. He wasn't saying we're going to seize United Fruit and take it into the hands of the Guatemalan people or the Guatemalan government. It wasn't a Cuban-style revolutionary government. He said we're going to take these areas of United Fruit that they're not using, and we are going to use them productively for the people. The government's going to take them, make them public, and use them to, increase the production of food so we can feed more Guatemalans. And he got boiled to death in a bathtub for that, for trying to take any of United Fruit's land, even the land they weren't using. Just wow. Because, that also would have provided competition for United Fruit, right? The thing about imperialism, or one of the aspects of imperialism that we'll talk about when we get to chapter 2 of this, is that not only does it exploit the labor and exploit the resources of its target country, but it exploits their markets as well. Right? So if the only company producing fruit or producing food in all of Central America, or the main one, is United Fruit, the people from Central America are going to buy products from United Fruit as well as work for them. And they're probably going to buy these products at incredibly inflated prices, but because these multinationals sell products all around the world and sell to markets in the countries they're targeting with imperialist actions, they don't want any competitors. They don't want people competing with them on those markets. So they look to monopolize, dominate, and control, which is the carpet bombing of Yugoslavia carried out by NATO in the late 90s, 1999, I believe, was largely because the manufacturing and the industry in Yugoslavia, which was run by their government, was starting to compete with U.S. industry. was starting to compete with Western multinationals in Eastern Europe and, sell to the same markets. So what does the US do? Just bomb them all. Bomb over, now I can't think of the exact statistics, but it was like 170 state-run factories, power plants, water supplies, the source of electricity, anything used to fuel infrastructure in former Yugoslavia was bombed by NATO during the bombing campaigns. It's because they were market competition, right? Can't compete with US companies on the market if your infrastructure gets blown up by bombs, I guess. Good evening, everyone. Good evening, Matthew. How are you? Good to see you. Good to see everyone. Biden says Latin America has moved from the back to the front yard of the U.S. So progress? Did he really say that? Is that a real quote from Biden? That's unbelievable. Great convo, but I got to go. Solidarity. Thanks for being with us. Really appreciate you stopping in and being active in the chat. The DPRK got bombed more than the U.S. did during the entire Pacific theater of World War II, and Vietnam got more tons of bombs dropped on them than the U.S. dropped in the entirety of World War II. Jeez. And it's just this tiny country. Think about that. World War II was the Axis versus the Allies, right? And the U.S. still dropped more bombs on this one small country, not even including the bombs that they dropped on Cambodia at the time, than they dropped during the entire World War. That's so insane. That is so insane. I laugh, but it's terrible. But socialism has failed in those areas. Yeah, right. Even though they survived until now, getting bombed into the Stone Age. Literally, I said, I always say that the Cold War was not cold. The Cold War in Korea, in Vietnam, in Latin America, in Africa, in Southern Asia, and most of the global South was a hot war because the U.S. and the CIA and whatever forces backed by finance capital were going in and bombing them and killing them and torturing them. Look at Operation Condor. The U.S. attempted to kill and torture every single left-leaning person in all of Latin America. Right? That's a hot war. It was only a Cold War considered a Cold War because the U.S. and the Soviet Union never came to blows. They never actually fired on each other. They just, had all these proxy conflicts where the USSR was backing workers' movements and independence movements, while the U.S. was backing fascists and right-wing paramilitaries like the Contras in Nicaragua who would torture and massacre people and destroy their homes. They literally said in the transcripts that the threat to the peace isn't in Turkey. It is in Cuba, and they wanted to invade Cuba. They knew and didn't care. They casually talked about how it would result in the deaths of thousands of Cuban civilians. Yeah, this is what I'm talking about. Then people should, if you get a chance, read those transcripts from JFK. I have them in a book. I believe this is it. I believe I still have the book that I had to read in history class called Discovering the American Past to look at the evidence. And a lot of what this book does is pretty good. It had you just look at various sources from various different outlets, like even sources surrounding labor issues. Like if there was a labor strike in the U.S. in the early 1900s, we would have to look at like the Chicago Tribune, I believe, was one of the sources that was like a pro-business outlet. And then we would have to look at a pro-labor outlet, someone who was on the side of the workers and see how they tell the story differently. And then you realize it's kind of scary that we don't have that anymore. We don't have a labor newspaper anymore. We don't have a labor media anymore. I mean, we do. We have streams like this. Now we have outlets like the Midwestern Marx Institute. We have various outlets who are now coming about because of the deterioration of capitalism and capitalist conditions of life, are giving people impulse to do real news and real journalism. But in the mainstream, we don't have any pro-labor, or anti-war outlets. And then these super important sources, these super important leaked transcripts, like the ones that show JFK talking to a bunch of CIA analysts who want him to nuke the USSR, nuke Cuba. You know, that stuff's swept under the rug. That stuff's not reported on. So it's not even mainstream knowledge. Everyone just thinks the USSR were the bad guys in the Cuban Missile Crisis. Ban the sex bots in this chat. I'm working on it. Do we not have any mods? If there are any mods in here, please ban the bots for me if you get a chance. Lol, dang sex bots. They're always here. They are always here, and I can't always. I'm here. What up, Peta Mio? Thanks, comrade. Just go ahead and ban those people spamming the bots if you get a chance. Sorry, no worries. No, don't worry about it. I know I missed it too. They're here all the time. I mean, they do that all the time. So please do not worry. Also, I don't want, even our mods, I don't want y'all to feel obligated. Like you just have to, stare at the chat the whole time and ban anything weird. I want you to enjoy the streams too. So United Fruit enrages me. It's crazy. It's a crazy story. It is. My Cold War history course just brushed over the missiles in Turkey as if they weren't an issue. Like when it's the Soviet civilians that threat, it's not an issue. Yeah, they don't matter. The Soviet Union was just killing their own civilians for fun every day anyways. Who cares if the U.S. pointed nukes at them? Ooh, so do people want me to move on to imperialism now and talk about chapter 2 of Imperialism, do the next part of that reading guide, or what's the move? Do people want me to answer questions? Do people want to send 1 million super chats and like and share the stream? Just kidding, but that's what you should do. Just kidding. Sorry, I'm taking care of something that I had to do earlier right now, or that I should have done earlier right now, but it'll take 2 seconds. Yep. Chapter 2. People want chapter 2. Yes, let's do Lenin. All right, everybody wants it. Let's go. I was hoping y'all would say that. So, last time on our reading guide, edition number 2, season 2, volume 2. I don't know what to call it. Second edition, I think, is what I've been calling it. Because, of course, I've done a reading guide of Lenin's Imperialism before, but now I'm redoing it. Last time, we talked about the concentration of production and the concentration of capital, meaning capital coalescing into a smaller number of hands, as well as production coalescing, machine and wage labor-based production coalescing into the factories, which then creates the basis for the owners of those factories to coalesce into monopolies. Right. So rather than one capitalist at the head of every factory, we now have conglomerates and corporations and joint stock companies at the head of many factories. So this is what we call the concentration of capital, or the concentration of production and the concentration of capital, which leads to capitalist imperialist stage. It's monopoly stage. Competition, free competition between different competitors in the market is one of the characteristic and principal features of capitalism when it first starts, when it first begins. Now, this characteristic feature of capitalism over time, this characteristic feature called free competition, dialectically becomes its opposite, right? So free competition, because it motivates corporations to control more and more and more markets and more of the market, it leads them to monopolize. It leads them to coalesce and try and dominate the entire market. It leads to markets dominated by monopoly. So markets based on free competition through time and through the development of capitalism become markets dominated by monopoly. Competition has dialectically become its opposite through development. Now, last time we talked about the role of industry and the role of big manufacturing firms in causing this to happen. But Lenin mentions at the end of the chapter that the banks played a huge role as well. And in fact, you can't really understand the concentration of production in capitalism and capital without understanding the role of the banks and how the banks facilitated that. So at first, when banks first come about in the early stages of capitalism and free competition capitalism, they serve as an intermediary for payments. Right. So they allow for inactive capital to become active capital for the capitalist class. So if a capitalist wants to start producing something, he can take a loan from the bank, pay for the productive commodities he needs to produce it, and then pay the bank back with interest once he starts making money off of his production. So it facilitates payments. One capitalist can pay another capitalist farther away using the bank to intermediate that payment, and it starts to be a method for financing production. So this is largely what leads to concentration and powerful monopolies to form, or this facilitates concentration and powerful monopolies, who now command most or all of the capital and finance capital and money capital in the world, in the United States as well. So yeah, the concentration of banks is a fundamental process in the transformation of capitalism to imperialism. That's the way Lenin describes it, a fundamental process. So last time we talked about this fundamental process, meaning the convergence of industry. Now we're talking about the convergence of banks, which overlap and are both essential in the transition of capitalism to its imperialist stage. So he uses some statistics from his day. At the time, large German banks had increased their deposits 40% over 5 years, just showing how the banks were expanding. And big banks had come to dominate. So almost 9 German banks had almost 50% of all the deposits, which were growing very fast. And then mid to large banks had the rest. So larger and larger banks are coming to dominate more and more of the total value, total capital in society. Also, a lot of the small banks were becoming simply branches of the big banks, connected to the banks, or the bigger banks are owned by the big banks, essentially acting as an arm of their control. So the total banking capital was owned, or 83% of total banking capital was owned by the 9 big Berlin banks at this time. Total domination by the big banking monopolies. So one of the major components that allowed for this to happen, this concentration to occur, was the subordination of smaller banks to larger banks, like I said. So larger banks would use their wealth to buy holdings in smaller banks, use it to buy capital, or use it to buy capital from small banks, and control them using the credit system. Various financial methods were used by the big banks to control the smaller banks. But what it largely did was allow these giant banking groups to form. Big groups of medium, small, and large banks, which all gravitate around one big central bank. So at this, one of the major ones at this point was the Dutch Bank Group. I don't know exactly how that's pronounced. DEUTCH Bank Group. But they permanently controlled 17 banks and partially controlled 13 banks at the time, which doesn't seem like a ton, right? They only permanently controlled 17. I mean, that's a lot, but they partially controlled 13. But there are different degrees of control in banking, which Lenin goes through here. So these banks, the 17 banks controlled by the Dutch bank and the other 13 partially controlled them, controlled 34 banks in their own right, and partially controlled 14 more. So the Dutch bank controls all these banks, which then control 48 other banks, right? And those 48 other banks also control 87 other banks, right? So actually, I think 87 might be the total amount of banks. So it's more like 30 banks. But either way, Dutch Bank Group, this giant, huge bank, controls the medium to large size banks, which control the smaller banks, which control the smaller banks. So you have different degrees of control, but basically this entire banking group, this entire banking system is rotating around this one dominant bank, which is very similar to how the global financial system looks today, dominated by US-based Western banks. So this allows financial activity to greatly increase financial operations. It allows for these banking groups to give giant loans to capitalists, which does give impulse to production. Allows for capitalists to take out more loans using the credit system and expand their productive forces, expand their factories and things like that. And this is all occurring at the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century. So Lenin said in the last chapter on the concentration of production, monopolization and concentration causes capitalism to change qualitatively at the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th. The end of the 1800s and the beginning of the 19th century is when monopolies come to dominate, and capitalism changes qualitatively into its imperialist stage. It's no longer free competition, it's now imperialist. And that's also at the time when you see industry monopolizing. And Lenin says simultaneously, that's the time you see banking monopolize. This all happens at the same time. So the monopolization of banking and industry are two separate processes, well, two deeply intertwined processes, but they both lead to the qualitative change of the capitalist system into a system of imperialism. So in the early days of capitalism, when Marx is writing in like 1860, 1870, there are scattered banking enterprises, but these become centralized. And what Lenin says this basically does is centralize all the individual scattered capitalists into one giant single national capitalist. So previously, you had a capitalist at the head of a factory, and he got the produce from that factory and exploited the workers in it. But as those isolated enterprises become centralized, and once they are merged with the banks into what we call finance capital, which we'll talk about later, it's essentially like having one giant capitalist controlling these vast swaths of production, which is, of course, a lot what our current finance capitalist system looks like today. So then these national capitalists who coalesced go abroad. They become international capitalists. So they expand to markets overseas. They, have factories or sweatshops working in countries that they don't even live in, that they may never see in their lives, because trade and commerce through the advancement of technology allows for global trade and global control of markets. So these giant capitalists who have coalesced come to dominate at home, come to dominate the domestic markets, and they look abroad and say, we're going to go get those too. So the bourgeoisie at the time, and a lot of the bourgeois ideologues that Lenin quotes here, call this process decentralization. So what they mean is decentralization of economic activity. No longer is economic activity centralized for the capitalist into this isolated area where he can only reach certain markets. Now the development of monopolies and the development of trade and commerce allows for commerce to go on anywhere. If I'm a capitalist in America, I can sell products in Europe. I can own factories in Europe. I can control markets in Europe. Economic activity for the capitalist has become decentralized. But what it really is centralization, right? It's centralization of these different isolated enterprises who coalesce into one dominant, like Lenin said, basically a super large international capitalist. So what's actually centralization appears as decentralization to the capitalist. That's its form of appearance, as Marx would say, probably. So Lenin then compares older capitalist countries to Germany, which he just talked about. So Great Britain is the first one he uses, the old UK. Says this is a country that's had the capitalist mode of production for longer. It's been developing for longer, and they have even more concentration than Germany then. So the longer that capitalism has come about or been enacted, the more concentration, which is a rebuttal to people who are already arguing this idea that we hear all the time today, that this isn't real capitalism, right? These monopolies and banks that are forming, that's not real capitalism. That's crony capitalism. Real capitalism has free competition, right? Free competition is the essential feature of capitalism. So if there's monopolies, then it can't be considered real capitalism, and you can't say that capitalism doesn't work. But Lenin, by showing that the older the capitalist country is, the more concentration they have, he's showing that this is a natural process, an inevitable process that happens with capitalist development. As capitalism develops, free competition dialectically becomes monopoly, like we said. It's inevitable. There is no crony capitalism. It's just capitalism at a later stage of development. It's imperialist monopoly stage. So Great Britain has 4 big banks at the time, whereas Germany had 9. He looks at France, where capitalism has also been enacted longer. They have 3 big banks rather than 4 or 9. He also shows that the activity of these banks has been increasing steadily with time. Actually, not just increasing steadily, basically exploding at the turn of the century from the 19th to the 20th. The financial activity these banks are involved in just blows up as they're concentrating into fewer and fewer hands. So at first, like I said, the technical function of the banks was facilitating exchange, financing production, and storing money, right? They were intermediaries of exchange who helped the capitalists. But with their concentration, they increased their control of all commercial and industrial activity in society, all the production and distribution of goods. They not only do these banks know the exact state of the capitalists who store money with them because they control their money, so that gives them a competitive advantage over capitalists. But the banks can also control these capitalists with credit. Credit eventually becomes the source of financing for capitalists. So in order to buy their productive commodities, their tools, labor, factories, means of production, the things that create value, which they then use to create commodities, which they then sell on a market for money, which they can reinvest in production and also take home as a surplus. That whole process is now controlled by the banks because you can't start production. You can't get your productive commodities without the credit system and without taking money from the banks, who's then going to try and get you hooked or in debt to them. So they really own you and they really control the entire operation that you've got going as a capitalist. They can threaten to deprive you of capital and financing at any time. Or if you're a capitalist who's more favorable to the banks, who does what the banks want, they can increase your financing, right? And Lenin shows examples of this, of times where the bank threatened to take people's financing away and give it elsewhere, right? The people who were to capitalists who would work more in their interests. So this now banks are no longer an intermediary of exchange as this process of concentration takes place. Now they're dominating production and exchange. They become the most dominant economic unit in society, which subsumes and controls and merges with the capitalists, the previously most dominant economic units in society. So we see why this is called finance capital, right? It's no longer the dominance of industrial capital. It's the dominance of finance capitalists merged with industrial capitalists, controlling industrial capital. So at the time, Lenin is talking. Sorry, one sec. Let me see where I'm at. So he says at the time there are 2 giant banks that are struggling for hegemony in the U.S. And one of these banks, was it the U.S. or where? Hold on. Now I got to look it up. Let me just see where these banks were struggling for hegemony. I want to get this right for when I upload it on the YouTube. I can edit this out. Who were the banks fighting for hegemony? Were they in the U.S.? Oh no, it was in Germany. It was in Berlin. Okay. So there were 2 of the biggest banks in Berlin who were struggling for hegemony, who were struggling for dominance over production, dominance over the markets, dominance over financial activity, everything having to do with capitalism. So one of these banks eventually merges with another one of their competitors, the 3rd biggest bank. So the 2 biggest banks are in a battle. One of them is increasing and growing naturally, just growing. And the other one, in order to keep up and not fall behind, merges together with the 3rd biggest bank. And then with time, the 2 banks who were battling it out together for the number 1 spot begin to merge together themselves. Lenin says they come to agreements and start forming contracts, which are more and more durable with time, which are more and more permanent with time. So this is how competition drives concentration and monopoly. You have these two banks who are competitive with each other, which causes one of them to merge with another, more concentration. And then over time, they realize it's in their interest to merge with each other and just dominate the entire country and all their markets and all their production. So perfect example there of how competition leads to concentration. The merger of the banks at this point, when you have these two giant banks merge, that represents the merger of manufacturing capital, of industrial capital, because the banks so thoroughly control the manufacturing capitalists. They so thoroughly control production in the country. So if the banks merge, that means production can merge. And now, fewer and fewer people are going to be in control of more and more sources of productive output. So Marx says that this gives a common appearance of, or the appearance of common bookkeeping and distribution of means of production. So by bookkeeping, financial accounting becomes standardized. Practices for measuring capitalist transactions and how capitalists create value largely become standardized. Managerial accounting is considered accounting internal to the organization, and it doesn't follow strict and standardized rules necessarily. Whereas financial accounting is the kind of accounting that banks do, and the accounting that is done externally to the capitalist firm. And it does have standardized rules. It has rules that everyone follows and standardized processes, which come about and become standardized with the rise and the dominance of the banking system, the finance system. And Lenin actually mentions at this time that the practices of the bank become common because almost everyone's using them, right? Not only the capitalists, but the upper stratum of workers are now storing their money in banks as well. And, for those of us living in the year 2023, which is all of us, I think, you might hear that and recognize that it's different today, right? No longer is it only the richest upper stratum of workers who stores their money in banks, no longer just the engineers or whatever, the skilled laborers. Everybody's got a bank account, of course, right? And everybody uses Venmo or PayPal or these other methods of facilitating exchange, which are dominated by the banking system, the financial system. So the banks have only increased their dominance and their prevalence and their control in everybody's life since 1917 when Lenin wrote this. Now everybody uses banks and they become even more standardized. You learn about how to store your money in a bank account in elementary school. So also the ownership and distribution of the means of production appears common to everybody. So bookkeeping appears common and ownership. This is a Marx quote that Lenin uses here. So the fact that all markets and all production and all distribution are dominated by conglomerates right now, are dominated by just a few people, have just a few people overseeing production, leads to the appearance that this is common ownership, that, the bankers and the capitalists are making decisions with production and distribution based on what's good for everybody, right? Essentially a form of economic planning. But Lenin points out that it's not economic planning, and especially not economic planning that's in the social good, because the bankers and the capitalists who belong to the banks are still bound to, adherent to the laws of capitalism, the laws of the market. So they still have to manage production in a way that will bring in the most profit for them, even if that means, it has negative effects for the rest of society. So it's really more cooperative, more collective, more concentrated production, but with even more private ownership. So ownership is concentrated into fewer and fewer hands. And this, although it gives the appearance of being a more collective, more planned system of production, it's just a more concentrated system of production. And production itself may be more cooperative, but what's produced is then appropriated by fewer and fewer people. So it doesn't, the system of capitalism has changed qualitatively from a system of free competition to a system of monopoly and imperialism. But that doesn't mean that it's not capitalism. It's still capitalism. They're still producing based on what brings them the most surplus value. It's just more concentrated production managed by less people, and managed by the finance capitalists and the banks. So it is still a capitalist mode of production, just a different stage of capitalism. Although this concentration and the concentration into a few hands, the banks, does increase the possibility for socialism, right? It creates the possibility for socialism because economic activity, the means of production, and finance have been centralized, right, into a few hands. All we have to do is seize it, right? All the workers have to do is take power of the government and, seize these giant banks, J.P. Morgan Chase, Citigroup, all the giant banks today, and you can manage production right there. They're already doing it. They're already ownership of production is concentrated into a few hands, and they already manage and administrate it. They just do it in a way that maximizes their own surplus value. So if we were to hypothetically seize these banks, we could just start administrating and controlling production in a way that is for the good of society, for the benefit of everybody, which would take time, and it would be a process of transition. But by bringing the means of production and by bringing workers together and concentrating ownership of them in fewer hands, the possibility for socialism becomes readily apparent, to the point where some people at the time were like, this isn't even capitalism anymore. This is like a socialist system with economic planning, which Lenin shows it's not, but it could be. So also at the time, you have savings banks, which are coming about and are actually concentrating as well. So savings banks, this is a function that still exists in society today. They used to accept the money, accept deposits from workers or whoever, and then they would pay interest on them. So they pay you money for keeping your money in savings, like what we call a savings account today. This originated in Europe to try and get poor people, try and get working people involved with the banking system. If you read about it today on Wikipedia, they'll say that the goal of it was to help poor people save money and become economically stable. But it was more because finance capital was becoming dominant. The banks were stepping into this new role as the dominant class within imperialist monopoly capitalism. And they wanted to get everybody they could involved with the banking system, dependent on the banking system. So they opened these savings banks to try and get workers to invest. But of course, these savings banks have to find a way to make money. They can't just pay you interest. So they start getting involved in loan activity. They start getting involved in financing the activity of capitalists and the other activities that non-savings banks would do, until eventually they merged with the profiteering banks. They moved with the deposit banks with only mild resistance from the legal system. Because at first they were saying, these savings banks, they're for the workers. These are intended to help people. They need to be kept separate from the deposit banks. Okay, well, how do the savings banks make money to pay workers back interest then if they're not making money anywhere else? Well, they can't. So they begin to merge with the deposit banks until eventually they merge into the same thing. Right now, we don't even know what a savings bank is. We only know what a savings account is, because the savings banks have merged with the for-profit banks. Now, the for-profit banks carry out that function. So this happens in the U.S. Between 1880 and 1908. At this time, we also have a decreased importance of the stock. Decreased importance of the stock exchange, Lenin's going to say. So, of course, the stock exchange largely becomes controlled by giant banks. The bourgeois economist at the time that Lenin quotes calls the stock exchange in Germany an expression of German industry, which is consciously regulated by the banks. So, the stocks, what they essentially represent is ownership in industry, ownership in factories, ownership in manufacturing. And if the banks come to control all of that, if they come to control all the stocks, then they're just going to dominate the stock exchange, and they can pretty much plan it out however they want, right? They can use one industry to boost their shares, boost their profit in another. So bourgeois economists who long for the days of free competition, capitalism's previous era, who say this isn't real capitalism now that these monopolies are here, they complain that the stock exchange is no longer free for everybody, but is dominated by these banks who regulate it however they see fit. So, nowadays we have libertarians who cry about crony capitalism and monopolies and say this isn't real capitalism. That's been going on forever. And Lenin shows in no uncertain terms that this is just a stage of capitalism's development. It is real capitalism. It's just capitalism after it develops over time and banks come to dominate all industry and the entire stock exchange. So these bourgeois scholars say that the stock exchange, one of them explicitly says the stock exchange is losing its essential feature, its essential function, meaning that it's a regulator of economic movements. And what he means by this is that it's no longer dominated by free competition, right? Free competition has been replaced by monopoly. We now have crony capitalism, according to these bourgeois scholars. So now I want to read a passage near the bottom of page 40, which I thought was really, really relevant for today when we're talking about the concentration of finance capital. So it says, 30 years ago, employers freely competing, this was a bourgeois scholar that Lenin's quoting. 30 years ago, employers freely competing against one another performed 9/10 of the work connected with their businesses other than manual labor. At the present time, 9/10 of this business's brain work is performed by officials. Banking is at the forefront of this evolution. So what he's saying there is that the administrative work, right, any work involved in a factory or a business other than manual labor, other than actually working with the commodities or transporting them, all of the planning, the organizing, the administrating, the creating the division of labor, trying to make the labor process as efficient as possible. 9/10 of it was done by capitalists, right? You also have managers and, engineers and these other skilled or professional managerial class forms of labor that are coming about at the time. They're emerging, right? But they wouldn't really emerge until the concentration of the banks, right? Until the domination of finance capital. Prior to that, the capitalists in charge of their own capital would do most of that work, 9/10 of it. But then with the concentration of the banks, that's all done by officials. Like I said, managers and staff hired by the capitalists to manage their capital for them. So what does that leave for the capitalists to do? Absolutely nothing. Yet still today, we consider people like Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos and these capitalists to just be next level geniuses doing some insane amount of work that us working people can't even fathom. Like, there's a reason Jeff Bezos and Elon Musk are always getting pictures taken of them on their yachts. It's because that's all they have to do. They could just hang out all day and hire a bunch of managers, either, managers to manage their facilities and their factories, or hedge fund managers to literally manage their capital for them, which is also a product of banking and finance capital. And they don't have to do anything and they'll continually make money, right? The more involved that Elon actually gets with his businesses, the worse his businesses do. Just look at the whole Twitter debacle. But with the concentration and the development of banking and monopoly capitalism, the capitalists have to do less and less and less and less, and they can just hire managers to do it all for them, whether managers of their capital or managers of their labor, of the labor that they hire. So at this time, there's a tendency towards monopolistic agreements among the largest banks and the largest industrial capitalists. America at the time had two giant banks, Rockefeller and Morgan. They were the two largest, and America saw a concentration of capital that was very accelerated, much faster than really anywhere else on earth. And these giant banks, Rockefeller and Morgan, quickly came to control the stock exchange, which, as we said earlier, is basically just a representation of industry, an abstract representation of material industry. So these banks and investment groups connected to them not only through controlling financing and controlling what productive capital these capitalists have access to, can they control the capitalists, but they can just buy shares. They can buy stocks. They can come to own the entire stock exchange and directly dominate how production is carried out. So that's a huge part of the transition towards monopoly. It happens very quickly in the US as these two giant banks come to control most of the stock exchange. And today, of course, we have banks like JP Morgan Chase, the Bank of America, Wells Fargo, Goldman Sachs, and Citigroup are the most dominant banks. And then we also have these investment groups that just manage capital like Vanguard and BlackRock, who have their hands in literally everything. But all of these banks, even though there's a handful of them, are connected through monopolistic agreements, right? All the banks and the industrial capitalists are connected. You better believe these investment groups like Vanguard and BlackRock, with a lot of the richest people in the world invested in, like I said, every industry, also have deep connections, deep ties with the bank. So not only do they come to dominate industry and the stock exchange, but they work together once they've monopolized into a few hands to maintain their domination. They still compete with each other a little bit in various ways, but there's more monopolistic agreements between these banks as they concentrate. So, yep. And you also have, of course, banking, finance, capital apparatuses connected to the government. You have the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, the Fed. And these are basically arms of the same finance capitalists. The same finance capitalists who control Vanguard Group and BlackRock and Goldman Sachs and Citigroup and all these are the finance capitalists who directly or indirectly control the IMF, the World Bank, and the Fed. Which is why, when the banks went under in 2008, when they crashed, because banks and monopolies do not make the capitalists immune to crises, and sometimes they make the crises worse. When they crashed, the Fed came and bailed them out, right? The government, which is a dictatorship of capital, came and bailed out the big banks. They would never bail out the poor. They would never do anything, they would never give welfare to us or anything helpful to us because they have to be fiscally responsible, right? And that's what they tell us. But then when the banks go under, immediately they get bailed out by the government because the financial arms of the government also belong to the banks. So Lenin calls it a dictatorship of capital, which we'll go over state and revolution at some point too. So industries' dependence on the banks only increases with time. The banks control their financing. The banks own shares in them. And the banks can now appoint board members to the biggest industrial firms, right? So if you control the majority stock in a company, like I said, the banks are buying up stock. That means you get to appoint who's on that company's board and who's making decisions for that company. So as that happens, not only are there economic ties between industry and banking, but there are personal ties, right? Those who dominate the bank, the board of directors at the bank gets to know the board of directors on the industrial companies. And, the industrial companies have capitalists sitting on the board or the bank's board and vice versa. So you have a personal relationship that's formed between these entities. So Lenin calls it a personal union. And this is also something that we call the revolving door, but it also involves the government, right? So we were talking about the connection and the control of the government by finance capital before. And this still happens a ton today, which we'll talk about. But you also have these former government officials or former people who worked at the World Bank or the Fed or people who worked at the IMF then get put on the boards of these banks, or they get put on the boards of industrial capital connected to the banks. And then when they're done with that job, they'll go back to the government. And then when they're done with that job, maybe they'll go work for the Pentagon, right? And this is what we call the revolving door between private industry and the public sector, like the banks, but also between industry and finance capital, between productive industry like manufacturing and finance capital like banking. So this revolving door goes every way, and it's so obvious. Like, they don't even try and hide the revolving door in the US anymore. Most American administrations or most cabinets appointed by the president are literally banking executives for the most part. People who, are on the board at Goldman Sachs and whatever other giant company. So they've come to fully control the government. The government at this point is nothing but a tool of finance capital. I'm pretty sure Joe Biden might actually be a puppet. Like they're doing a Weekend at Bernie's thing where some Goldman and Sachs executives like have him controlled by strings. I'm not sure entirely, but they might as well because he's, serving their interests. And of course, this allows the banks to control policy. This helps the banks control the financial arms of the government, like the Fed, or like various regulatory arms, whatever, and get done whatever they want to get done. So Lenin also talks about how the transition to monopoly also changes the division of labor within finance itself. So within the banks themselves, you see an increase in specialization. There are now managers who work for the banks who control specific localities, or there are managers who are in charge of specific firms, specific capital that belongs to the bank. The banks have managers of foreign industry, managers who control the bank's investments and their capital and their manufacturing outside of whatever country they're based in, which goes along, obviously, there's a lot to say about that in connection to imperialism, which, is technically what we're looking at. We haven't talked about war or economic sanctions or what we consider to be acts of imperialism yet. We've only talked about the concentration of production. But with the banks hiring managers to control foreign industry, we see the first hints of that, the first hints of imperialism, the first hints of Western banks or domestic banks controlling markets, resources, and labor abroad, to the point where they actually have to hire managers with the specific focus of doing so. So the development of the banks also increases the amount of research and knowledge that we have about industry and markets as a whole, which is almost a good thing. Like obviously the monopolization of banks and the imperialist stage, it's hard to put a moral judgment on it, whether it's good or bad. It just is what it is. But in many ways, it increases technological capacity, humans' productive capacity, because the banks are financing all this production, all these factories that they control. The banks are doing a lot of research that helps these industries that they control, including research into like technology. Right? Like, how do we research these machines how do we make these machines more conductive? I'm stumbling over my words. How do we make these machines more productive? Well, the banks are going to fund a research project, to try and figure that out. So in a way, the banks finance the development of production and the productive forces, which creates the possibility for socialism, like I said. Increases the productive forces, makes them readily available to seize by the working class, so that they can use them for the good of society rather than for the good of capital. So there is a lot of productive and technological advancement at this time. So the banks also start to have a universal character, right? The banks are less specialized. They mostly just do the same operations. They used to just serve one branch of industry, or they would just do one thing. Like I said, you would have the savings banks versus the deposit banks, and some banks that were in manufacturing, or some banks that were targeted at steel, some banks that were targeted at lumber, and the capitalists in that industry could store capital or store money in the bank. But with time, this specialization goes away. The banks all do one thing. And I mean, the banks all do a variety of things, a variety of functions, and their control is vast, right? Their control isn't isolated to one industry or one workplace. They control a vast number of workplaces and perform the same functions for all of them. So at this time, a lot of industrial capitalists, and by this time, I mean Lenin's time, a lot of industrial capitalists start to complain about the control of the banks. Like we said, they complain about crony capitalism. And Lenin said this is the exact same phenomena as when small capitalists, meaning small business owners, complain about big business owners, suppressing them, dominating the markets, and not letting the small capitalists exploit their workers and accumulate that much wealth. It's only that same argument between small and large capital being played out on a larger scale. Being played out in the stage of imperialist monopoly capitalism rather than in the stage of free competition. And by the way, that's also why communists and socialists at a time can ally with the petty bourgeoisie. especially at first, can ally with the small business owners, because not only do they usually have beef with the big businesses, but they usually have beef with the finance capitalists, with the bankers as well. Interesting little theoretical point there, though. So a lot of the older bankers at the time were warning the younger, greedier ones that this increased in control of industry by the banks and the increased risk, or led to increased risk of trade fluctuations. They led to increased risk of crisis. So a lot of the younger bankers at the time who had seen this move to monopolization were just like, this is the best. Look how much money we're making. Look how much we're accumulating. This is awesome. And the older bankers were saying, yeah, but this is going to lead to trade fluctuations. This is going to lead to crisis. And obviously the older ones were correct, as the Great Depression followed less than 10 years after this. And, we have the 2008 crisis today. More examples than we can count on one hand of times where the monopolies and the big banks crashed and left the economy in a destitute situation. But there were people, younger capitalists, like I said, arguing that no, now that capital is concentrated into a few hands, these banks are going to be able to control production, right? They're going to be able to manage production and basically do economic planning, and there won't be any more crises, right? Of course not. The banks, come to dominate production more so, but they still can't dominate the laws of capitalism. They're still subject to the laws of capitalism, which allow for consistent crises and actually necessitate consistent crises. So this is not an organized. Some people at the time were calling it an organized capitalism. That was the name they were giving to it. It's not organized capitalism just because there was increased control and planning. As Lenin has said multiple times, capitalism is still reliant on its laws. It still has to produce surplus. It still has to produce based on creating a surplus by selling commodities in a market, which is going to lead to incessant crises. It's always going to be an anarchic system, always going to be a crises-ridden system that even these dominant conglomerated banks are going to lose control of periodically. So with industry's transition to monopoly, the merger of industries and banks also takes place at the transition of the century from the 19th to the 20th century. And this is spurred on by the 1890 crisis and the economic crisis that happened right at the turn of the century in 1900. So there's a crisis. Everybody goes out of business or goes under, essentially. And then the banks at this time build much closer ties with the industrial capitalists. You see a massive investment of capital and a massive furthering of the concentration of capital, which is always a product that comes from crises. You always have capital that's invested shortly after, or invested in the recovery of the crisis, and this leads to further concentration and furthering of the relationship between industrial capitalists and banks. So this, of course, is that qualitative change from capitalism's free competition stage to its imperialist stage. But next time, we're going to talk more about those connections between industry and the banks, right? So in chapter 1, we talked about the development and concentration of industry. In chapter 2, we talked about the development of concentration and concentration of the banks. In chapter 3, we're going to talk about their merger together as well as their merger with the government. How do they control the state? How do they control, the arms of the state, like the military, IMF, World Bank, all of that? And that chapter is called the financial oligarchy. I already mentioned, I don't know if that's the exact name, but I already mentioned like the financial executives who are in Biden's administration, who are in the Obama administration, who are in the Trump administration. So this is what we're talking about, the control of the banks the control of the government by the finance capitalists. Finance capital and the financial oligarchy is the name of chapter 3. So that's what we'll be talking about next. Now that we've talked about industry separately and the banks separately and kind of isolated them and look at their development, we'll look at their merger together and their merger with the government, with the capitalist state. So yeah, I think it's kind of interesting that a book about imperialism in the modern era hasn't mentioned war yet, right? It hasn't mentioned war. It hasn't mentioned coups. It hasn't mentioned economic sanctions, which were very much a thing at the time. all that it's mentioned is industry, production, manufacturing, things like that, and then banks and how they concentrate. So it's a strictly economic argument at this point that mentions politics a few times. And we'll get more into the political aspect with chapter 3. But this is Lenin sticking to the Marxist method. This is Lenin using dialectical materialism to analyze imperialism and capitalism in its new stage. Right? So he doesn't start with politics. He doesn't start with war. He understands that those things are a product of the relations of production. They're a product of the productive base. So he has to analyze the productive base first in the first 2 chapters. So he's looking at these institutions, these entities directly involved in production and how they've changed over time, the industries and the banks. How have they changed? They become concentrated and they become dominant, hegemonic. Right? Then they come to control the politics up here. So next week or next chapter, we'll get into the superstructure a little bit. Then once they control that, they can go abroad and control other countries. But still, even when we get to that point, we won't only focus on war and economic sanctions, right? The political aspect. We'll talk about how they control markets, how they export capital, how the banks appoint managers of foreign capital, and you know how that's done, how it's carried out, how they control labor. So it's still heavily based in production. Everything that happens politically is for the purpose of controlling production. If you want a more political analysis of imperialism, and one that, you know, expands the analysis of Lenin in 1917 or updates it for modern day, read Vijay Prasad's Washington Bullets. What Washington Bullets does, it's still an economic analysis. It's still a dialectical materialist Marxist analysis, but it looks at the development of the political and legal systems since at least the end of World War II that are relevant to imperialism and capitalism's imperialist stage. So you look at the development of the UN and how it's been used as a tool. Look at the IMF, the World Bank, these global systems of banking, these global trade agreements, shit like that. All sorts of different things that are connected to production, connected to the banks, and connected to industry, and connected to markets, but are political or legal changes in the superstructure. That's basically what Washington Bullets is. And I think it's a great book. I think it's a great book that extends on this one, almost like an update to that one, but it does focus more on the political. So, yeah, I'd recommend people read that too. I always just got to give Vijay a shout out, you know. Oh, woo. All right. So that's chapter 2. Wow, what a day today. Not only did I get through Jordan Peterson's most popular video about why communism evil, but I got through chapter 2 of Lenin's Imperialism. We got through a reading guide too. If later today I edit my Origins of the Family, Private Property, and the State video and finish filming it, which I've got about, it'll probably take me, 3-4 hours to finish, then it's been the most productive day of all time, and I'll be pumped. Did they kick you off TikTok? Yes, they did. Today, one of my old wrestling coaches sent me a TikTok, and I couldn't even watch it because every single social media account or phone number or email I have has been banned from TikTok. So all at separate points. So yeah, I think my face is banned there at this point. The banks, Lenin is an anti-Semite. Yeah, I mean, when we talk, Lenin railed against anti-Semitism because anti-Semitism was rampant at the time, obviously in the lead up to World War II. And it was a problem in Russia. There were these reactionary groups, anti-Semitic groups that Lenin had to argue against and try and, you know, if the working people were being won over by them, like the Black Hundreds, for example, the communists had to try and win the working people back and explain why anti-Semitism was wrong. And this is the perfect book to do so, right? It's not any group of people. It's not Jewish people. It's just the banks, period, who can be owned by literally anybody. They can be owned by a person with no arms and no legs. They can be owned by someone of any color, any gender, any sexuality. right? It's the banks and how they function materially, how they function as an economic unit, and how they concentrate. It has nothing to do with the identity traits of the individuals controlling the banks. And this is why I say Marxism is the biggest debunk of race essentialism, or the ultimate debunk of race science and race essentialism. It's not any individual skin color or racial makeup that drives history, right? Humans are divided into economic classes, which are based on our relationship with the means of production, right? And the ruling economic class can, use racism as a tool. They can try and enforce racism, or like in the US, use racism to argue that some people aren't fully human and therefore we can own them as slaves, right? But that still all stems from the economic ruling class trying to maximize exploitation. It doesn't stem from any inherent difference between black people and white people, or between various groups of people. Every difference and every development is driven by class struggle. And economic classes aren't determined by any identity trait. It's determined by your relationship to the means of production. So it removes this hyper obsession with identity that liberals have, and allows for universal struggle between various groups based on their relationship to the means of production. And that's why when you hyper focus on identity and you don't look at class, you take away the possibility for universal struggle, struggle of different identity groups based on their relationship to the means of production. Like the human nature argument or the utopian argument. Yes. Those are my least favorite ever. Oh, Dr. Paul Kengor was on PragerU. I can't wait to check that out. Dr. Paul Kengor did not impress me last time. Oh, if we got any super chats today or any new members, I'm really sorry that I missed it. You can become a YouTube member now. It's basically like being a Patreon supporter. We've also got patreon.com/MidwesternMarks if you want to support us financially. You can also just like, share, and comment on the stream if you want to help us. But if you want to support us financially, you can on Patreon, become a Twitch member, become a YouTube member, whatever you prefer. Yeah. Lenin is a great writer, and Imperialism is one of my favorites. Meanwhile, Marx likes to confuse me with his 20 Yards of Lenin. Yeah, I've been reading, it's over there, I'm not going to grab it, but I've been reading volume 2. And then, I was going to stream the other day, and I was like, I bet you I could summarize Lenin's Imperialism really quick. I bet you I could redo my old reading guide really, really fast. And my old reading guide took me a while to make because I was first starting out with Marxism. But like after reading volume 2, I'm like, I bet you I can fly through Lenin and summarize it. And I haven't been flying through. I've been doing it thorough just because that's how I have to do things. I don't let myself half-ass stuff. But it's been very fast, and it's just like, man, Lenin is concise. Man, Lenin is makes this stuff easy to understand. And even the part today where he quoted Marx, I had to like slow down. I'm like, okay, wait, this isn't Lenin writing anymore. This is Marx, and it just is more complex. And I love reading Marx. I love how much, how dense his sentences are, how much information is packed into one sentence. But yeah, it can be a lot sometimes if you're just trying to wrap your head around it. And that's why Lenin is so great. Distills everything so that us normal folks can understand. Engels does a lot of that too. You have a reading guide for utopian, socialism, utopian, and scientific. I need to do one. I literally had one written at one point. I had it written out, and I just never got around to filming it like an idiot. But this is one of my favorite books. I've read it like 5 times. Honestly, after I finish the Imperialism guide, I'll do this one. I also have an Origins guide that I've started that I need to finish. But this one would not take long, and this one is so important. Everyone read Utopian and Scientific, but yeah, I do not have one yet, unfortunately. Oh, no worries. I'm loving it so far. Just finished the intro. Good. I'm glad you're loving it. Just remember at the start, like if it starts to get confusing, Engels is talking about other thinkers at his time, right? He's talking about what other thinkers have said and what they've argued about socialism. So just keep that in mind, that he's responding to a lot of the thinkers of his day. So if you don't know who those are, it might get a little confusing and you might get overwhelmed. Just focus on Engels' arguments, and understand that that's what he's doing. I started reading Capital. Please be proud of me. I'm so proud of you. I keep going. You're going to make it through. Now I got to get up and get volume 2. I said I wasn't going to do it, but just know that as you're struggling through Capital, I'm in grad school melting my brain with healthcare administration every day while also trying to get through volume 2. And not just get through volume 2, but understand every word of volume 2. This is how much I have left, which is crazy. I do not have much left. Not much else to learn about circulation, the circulation of commodities. But yeah, that's what I'll be grinding with while you're grinding through volume 1. It's not that hard. Actually, volume 2 does start to get hard. I lied. It does start to get complicated, but volume 1 is fun to read once you get the hang of it, right? Once you get the idea of what Marx is saying, his writing style, once you get an idea of dialectical materialism, and once you get past the first 3 chapters, I think it's a great book. Like I remember my second time reading Capital, once I was halfway through, I was like, I'm really, really, truly enjoying myself right now. I am truly enjoying reading this book, and I understand it without having to, slow down and write everything out on a piece of paper and work out these mathematical equations, which cannot say the same for volume 2. I spend a lot of time writing in a notebook and working out Marx's mathematical equations so that I can understand every sentence he says in that book. It's fun though. Not discouraging anyone to read volume 2. You got to read volume 2 and 3, and you don't have to read it as closely as I am either, So yeah, I'm on chapter 3 right now. Nice. Chapter 3 is the last really hard chapter. Well, I both love and hate dissecting Marx. I feel you. Yeah, definitely. JP got demolished. LOL. Thank you. I'm glad you thought so. What was I gonna say? I don't know. Yeah, the first 3 chapters, Marx is really just using Hegel. He's really using Hegel's method, and he's making the analysis, and it's detailed and thorough. But he's not like explaining things for the layman. He's not explaining things for people who have no idea what he's talking about. It's almost like he expects you to read Hegel first. Zizek is capitalism's court jester. Oh, shout out to Gabriel Rockhill, huh? Started reading Fundamentals of Communism by Engels. Great stuff so far. That's a wonderful book. Great one to read. There are so many good ones. Like if you're just starting out, if you're just getting the basics, like there are so many helpful books. Like one of the stupidest things I ever did, because I was young and arrogant, and people who watch the stream consistently know this, that I started with Capital Volume 1, right? I wanted to learn about Marxism. Somebody told me that was Marx's masterpiece where he analyzes the economy. And I'm like, oh, I'll read that then. So I read Volume 1, barely understood it. But then read all these smaller books. I read Utopian and Scientific like 3 times. I read Wage, Labor, and Capital. I read Foundations of Leninism, Principles of Communism, Marxism and the National Question, Dialectical and Historical Materialism, On Contradiction. All right, and then I came back to Capital Volume 1, and I was like, oh, it all makes sense now. This wasn't that confusing. I just had no idea what I was reading, and I still made myself finish it for some reason. But yeah, that is Not what I would recommend. Read a bunch of the small ones first. It'll be more fun, more entertaining, and then you'll understand capital more. I was just being arrogant, and I thought I could understand anything at the time. I've also finished some sections of Marx's German ideology. I'm still reading parts of Volume 1 where he's critiquing Feuerbach. I'm still doing Marxist educational reading. Nice. German ideology is a great one, too. That's another one of the ones I read in between reading Capital for the first and second time. That really, really, really helped me. Actually, the German ideology, I always say that's the one I wish I would have read first, right? Because most of the questions I had about politics and anti-communist historians and stuff is answered by the German ideology when he talks about the great man of history fallacy and all this. All right, y'all. I'm going to have to head out now. We've been here for almost 3 hours. It's been a great stream. I'm sorry I can't keep going, but I'm running out of steam. I got to finish my homework today, too. So thank you very much for hanging out. Thank you to everyone who served as a moderator, everyone who sent videos. Like I said, you can support us on Patreon. You can support us by becoming a YouTube or a Twitch member. You can support us by sending me a messenger pigeon holding millions of dollars, whatever you want, whatever you're feeling. So, or you can just support us by being a great comrade, and watching, sharing, commenting on, and liking our streams. But I hope these streams I hope y'all found this stream to be educational. I hope you learned something. I know I did. Really appreciate all the activity in the chat. Really appreciate you all and everything that you do, and the fact that you are as dedicated to changing this world for the better as me and Carlos. You're as dedicated to constructing socialism and seeing the end of capitalist imperialism as we are. So solidarity, keep reading. I love hearing about what y'all are reading. I love helping to answer questions and stuff like that. So keep going. I'm proud of you. Much love. Solidarity, everybody. Oh, sorry. Email address, Jacob? Yeah. Let me just put it in the Twitch chat for you. MidwesternMarks@gmail.com. Yep. Send that article to the Gmail. All right.